Hi everyone, this is Justin Gray from Synthesis Sound and Immersive Mastering. This video is going to be a deep dive into the concept of mastering music in the Dolby Atmos immersive audio format. Now for those of you who follow my content, I did make 2 videos on this a little bit over a year ago, but my own practice and aesthetics as well as experience and knowledge in this area have evolved considerably in that time, and so I'm looking forward to bringing some clarity to a commonly misunderstood aspect of the Dolby Atmos ecosystem, especially at this moment as the energy and interest surrounding this object-based audio format is growing rapidly. And so I look forward to sharing and hopefully helping to develop some clarity around this. Before I get moving, if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel. I try to make things like this whenever I find the time. Also, you can visit synthesissound.com. There you can learn about my studio and my work as a mixing engineer in Dolby Atmos and also Sony 360 and stereo. And even more pertinent to this video, you can connect with me as a mastering engineer at immersivemastering.com, where you can learn about my practice as a stereo mastering engineer, as a mastering engineer in Dolby Atmos and Sony 360. And most importantly, on both of those sites, there are links to playlists that I have made of my own work on Apple Music, Tidal, and Amazon. And I would encourage you to go there and check out the wonderful music that these artists have made. I've had such the honor and the privilege to work on this music. The Apple playlist here has well over 500 songs that I've worked on to date. And at the end of the day, this is all about music. It's all about art. And it's all about sound, and so I would encourage you to go check those out. So, my goal with this video. First, I'm going to establish and clarify some high-level technological details surrounding Dolby Atmos. We cannot move forward discussing the aesthetics and practices of mastering for this format without absolutely, firmly clarifying some important technical details which do sometimes get misunderstood. Then I will move into the area of immersive audio mastering aesthetics and just talking about what it is to master immersive audio, both discrete channel and object-based, because this is a practice that is not emerging today but has been a continuum for decades. And then moving into current practices of mine, as well as some of my colleagues, to mastering Dolby Atmos content. This first page is a few definitions that I'm actually going to read almost verbatim because, I worked on them, and in order for us to really discuss the aesthetics and the concepts around mastering for Dolby Atmos, which is certainly related to translation, right? It's related largely to the idea of translating that artistic vision at the highest level to the consumer. We have to understand what's on this page. First of all, we need to understand how this format is delivered. We need to understand how it's consumed, and we have to anticipate how it will continue to expand in the future because it is changing by the day. The next sentence here, the second bullet point, I'm going to read it as it is. For music production, Dolby Atmos is a creation, encoding, and delivery technology that provides immersive audio to consumers. Dolby Atmos is a creation tool. It's an encoding tool. That's probably Dolby's most brilliant addition to the whole area of object-based audio is the encoding process and the formats in which they ultimately deliver to the consumer, which are then decoded, and we all know the rest, or we'll continue to explore the rest as well in this video. Atmos is an adaptive immersive audio format, which uses a combination of discrete channel audio, which is our beds, and channel adaptive audio, which is our objects, to create an adaptive music delivery format. From a music consumer side, that is the DD Plus JOC, the AC4 IMS, and the Dolby True HD format. These 3 formats, these 3 file types which our music gets encoded to and then is delivered and decoded to the consumer, These are adaptive music delivery formats, and that is so important and leads me to the next point. Although speaker layouts such as 714 and 914, 916, I'm working in 9.2.4 right now, soon to be 11.2.6. Although large speaker layouts like those, with 7.1.4 being sort of the minimum, are required for high-level professional Atmos mixing and mastering, they are not required to produce music in the format, and they are not required for consumers to experience music in the format. I stress this, that on the creation side, someone can start creating music in this format with a pair of headphones or a pair of speakers or a 5.1 setup or a quad setup. And on the back end, we have absolutely no control over how consumers are experiencing this in terms of how many speakers they have and what kind of a technological environment they are setting up. What we do, and that's so important to understand, is that even though we're working on this beautiful immersive, speaker format, what feels like making something in 714 is not going to be even delivered as a discrete channel 714 file in many contexts. There are some ways to make that happen if you understand how the technology works. But in most contexts, especially like heavy object-based productions, we are not delivering to a consumer what we are working on. And that is so important to understand from a philosophical level when we're talking about translation, which is one of the key elements to the mastering mindset of thinking about translation. And so that's why we have to remember that. We all love working in these speaker formats. I love bringing someone in here to play it for them. I love creating in them, all of that. Of course, I like going to someone else's place. They hear my stuff. I hear their stuff. It's fantastic. But at the end of the day, from the consumer side, that's not what's happening, and it's not even what it's designed for. Of course, if someone sets up a 714 or a 916 in their home theater, fantastic. But those are the minority, and they have been for the entirety of immersive audio's history, which is decades now. The reason that we're here talking about this format with such excitement and such energy being put into it is its adaptive qualities. And we have to remember that because it is the core of the concept of translation. This last one is just like a little helpful way of sort of technologically thinking of what Atmos is. Atmos can be seen as a digital cube. It uses Cartesian coordinates containing audio and associated rendering metadata. For speaker playback, the OAR, or the Object Audio Renderer, renders a mix appropriate to the available playback system, meaning that even when your renderer is up and you've got your speaker layout chosen, the software itself is even not seeing this as a discrete channel playback. It sees itself and is itself a digital cube which contains audio streams and associated rendering metadata. And that is the information that will then be carried forward for the hopefully successful delivery and experience on the consumer end. Objects versus beds. These are the building blocks. We cannot discuss mastering in this format without understanding unequivocally what these are and how they are treated. An object. It can be viewed as a mono or stereo aux track with 360-degree channel adaptive positional metadata. I like thinking of it that way. I like looking at the renderer, seeing an object, and thinking of it as an aux track that I send to that is placed in a spatial position. It's the same as like having a mono bus, except that mono bus has positional metadata, because that's what you're doing. You're playing into the renderer, and those 118 available objects are all essentially mono buses, And yes, we can link them as stereo, but actually Atmos sees them all as mono. And it's a mono bus that has a position associated with it, which is its metadata. Some of the advantages to objects are that they can have their own individual binaural metadata, off, near, mid, or far. Objects remain as separate tracks in an ADM BWF delivery, and that's going to be important to understand when I discuss later my own approach to mastering in this format. Objects have a maximum potential for spatial distribution, which is rendering, the object renderer, the OAR, at a consumer playback level. This is very important. Objects have the maximum potential for spatial distribution. Now, when we discuss discrete channel positions, which we will do, and we're going to talk about the beds, at that point, they are the same from a consumer standpoint. But the minute that we move outside of a discrete channel position, the potential for spatial distribution is favored in the object, and that is essential to know. Objects are capable of engaging all panning locations. So for instance, the minute that I leave my left or right channel and I move into the space, pull back, in Pro Tools, be pulling back to 99 or 68, which is where our wide surrounds are, etc. All of that space in between needs to be engaged by using an object, which many of us know, but that's good. And objects are also required at this point because of the 7.1.2 limitation in the bed, which is not a Pro Tools thing, it's a Dolby thing. That's the limit of the bed. That's just the size of the bed that is available on the Dolby side. And so as a result, in order to create discrete front and rear height information, we must use objects. Challenges. Objects are limited to mono and stereo track width. This is a challenge. If the objects could be grouped in larger track widths, it would make things a little bit easier in certain capacities. And actually, the Sony 360 format can do that on the back end. Now, I know that we can use beds and we can then feed them into object beds. But at the end of the day, Dolby Atmos still will always see each of those individual objects as mono content. And it doesn't intelligently know that this one is related to this one or this one is related to this one. And that's very important when we start to discuss spatial coding and clustering. It can have major implications. It doesn't have to, but it can. A limit of 118 objects in an Atmos session, someone might say, well, that doesn't sound like a limit. I mean, I've worked on tracks where I've maxed it out. I work on tracks all the time where I max it out. So I'd love more. And multiple objects cannot easily experience bus-style processing. It is possible. First of all, there are many creative ways to use buses and object beds, etc. And it is also possible with sidechain processing and triggers to create that kind of behavior if and when desired, which will get explored later. But it is still a challenge. It's still a workflow challenge regardless. Now the bed. A bed channel is a predefined set of discrete speaker channel output paths. We set our quad bed or our 5.0 bed or our 5.1 bed or our 7.1.2 bed. All of those points at the corners of them, or just sending per channel, is going to be a discrete channel audio path. Beds allow for typical bus processing, sort of stereo-adjacent workflows, which everyone who's coming from the stereo world seems to want a lot, and for good reason. I'm not saying that there's not merit in it, but definitely people who are transitioning into the world of immersive and object-based audio are constantly reaching for familiar tools, and beds are more familiar than objects in that way. So traditional discrete channel processing is possible within the DAW with a bed. It also encourages discrete channel mixing. What I'll say is that the speakers are there for a reason. You know, the speakers in a 7.1 or a 7.1.4 or a 9.1.6, I mean, those positions of where those speakers are based on decades of research and very, very intelligent people deciding that these are the best places to place the speakers in these various arrays. And so they're there for a reason, and therefore using a bed can encourage us to use those positions, which are very strong positions. Can be, at least. The beds enable immersive effects plugins like reverbs and delays, things along those lines. In production workflows, again, sort of stereo adjacent, where I can send to an immersive reverb, etc. This can be expanded into an object bed or bed plus height object workflow. It's all doable, but just from an easy access, getting right into it, the bed channels make this a little bit easier in a workflow without more complicated templates. Challenges. The biggest one is that we're limited to 2 height channels. And in general, just that we're limited to channel width. I'd love to see a 9.1.6 bed, but it's not on Pro Tools. If Pro Tools does it, they're just going to feed it out to objects, because it would actually be Dolby that would be required to change the architecture of how the ADM is put together. They would need to expand that bed, and actually that would end up taking away channels from the objects, and it would, oh my gosh, I mean, I'm not saying I have no control over what does or doesn't happen, but the amount of complication for legacy material in the film world alone would lead me to believe that that's unlikely. So we have a limit of those 2 height channels, and that is a challenge. This is a particularly a challenge because when you send content to those height channels right in the middle, the center height channels, positions, it just sends the same audio to the front and the back. And for anyone who has good experience mixing an immersive, sending the same audio to multiple places, well, it's not a great idea in general. It can be done, of course, and sometimes rules are there to be broken, but when it comes to fold downs, where that height material goes, if you've got the same information in the fronts and the back on the height, the fold down behavior, anyone who's tested it properly will recognize the issue with sending any reasonable amount of volume to that position. Non-discrete channel information will be generated with phantom imaging between 2 points, rather than using the advanced spatial rendering capabilities of the OAR. So if I've got my right channel and my right surround, and I pan something in the bed right between them, or let's say I pan something in the bed right to where that right wide speaker would be at 68, that is going to get rendered as a consumer. That it's going to be played back as phantom imaging, meaning it's just going to play the amount of volume in those 2 speakers and hope for the best. That does not set Dolby Atmos up for the kind of success that it is capable of putting an object in the same place, because the advanced spatial rendering capabilities of an object are far beyond the abilities of phantom imaging in that capacity. And you can do tests and hear it for yourself. Another thing is that all content within a bed channel, let's say the right or the left or the center, must share the same binaural setting. So that hopefully clarifies, some very important details regarding beds and objects. But what I will do is actually just go back up here and read this before moving to the next slide. There is no discernible difference sonically between audio in an object or bed channel. That is very important to clarify and understand. It's not that if you put audio in a bed or an object, let's take an example. If I put audio in my right channel, mono content right channel, and I put it in my bed and I put it at the same level as an object, there is no discernible difference between those 2 sounds. There is no sonic advantage to one over the other. The object doesn't have some magic abilities. It's on the back end that it has those special abilities. It's more of a technological encoding and decoding advantage than a sonic advantage while you're working. And that's why we have to understand what those advantages are and how it all works in order to make those decisions. Now, I know that this is very mix related, but as you'll see when we get into discussing mastering, mastering is very mix adjacent in this format. And so if this stuff isn't 100% understood, you can make some serious mistakes when mastering and ruin something that did not need to be ruined. So now we come to spatial coding and clustering. Spatial coding. This is very important. In spatial coding and clustering, why? Why does it exist? Well, it exists because we need to just create a smaller file for streaming purposes. If we were to maintain the current size of our master deliverable of an ADM BWF, or even using Dolby True HD, which I hope we one day see as the format that is delivered for all speaker playback listeners. It's a lossless format. It's beautiful. Regardless, though, it requires about 10 times the bandwidth of a DD Plus jock right now. And so the reason for clustering and spatial coding is that we need to reduce, currently, we need to reduce the size of the file for successful delivery to a consumer using the internet and wireless technology and all the like. So spatial coding, beds and objects are given the exact same sonic treatment. There is, again, no sonic advantage to a bed or an object from a spatial coding standpoint. Every element of a master is given positional metadata, object audio metadata, including each bed position. So the left channel bed position is given positional metadata, and its positional metadata puts it in the left, just the same as an object in the discrete left channel position is given positional metadata for that position. So as a result, it's important to understand that when it comes to the creation of DD Plus Jock or Dolby True HD, everything in an audio stream essentially becomes an object, and it is then clustered. Clustering, I'm not going to go into it. There's some wonderful documentation out there if you really want to understand it. But a simple way of understanding it is taking objects, and again, remember, everything is now an object. So even the bed is now treated like an object in its position. Taking objects that are in similar locations and clustering them together into sort of one overarching object region or cluster. And what it does is it reduces the amount of locations available in any given moment. It is being updated, I should have this memorized, but it's being updated extremely fast, at a frame speed. There is an exact number, and I apologize for not knowing it, but it's happening faster than we can recognize. In every given moment, the clustering is intelligently doing its absolute best, and it's largely based on amplitude, so volume, in terms of what object is going to take precedent in terms of it having its position. So a simple way of understanding it would be like if you've got a really loud drum set in left and right, and then you've got some objects that are just over to the right of those, and in that moment you're out of other locations because the clustering has maxed itself out, then those quieter elements will cluster themselves closer. Now, in that process of spatial coding, this is the reason why, if anyone's ever listened to a DD Plus Jock, which is playing back over Apple Music on their Apple TV 4K, and soloed just the height channels and heard things sounding pretty garbly, that is because in that particular production, that height channel information is probably not loud or not as loud as other elements, and it is getting constantly clustered and sort of turned around in ways to prioritize other clusters, which usually means louder, more prevalent material. And so let's say you just have reverbs in the heights. Now, the intelligent thing, what you need to understand is spatial coding is not, spatial coding, the process understands that you have all the speakers on. And so it's actually using very, very intelligent ways of doing this that you don't hear it when you're hearing all the audio sources. So you're really not supposed to solo. Like spatial coding Dolby never said that you should be able to solo anything. The minute you solo it, you start to hear the processing. You start to hear the artifacts essentially taking place. But all of a sudden, when you turn all your speakers back on, it becomes a relatively invisible process. And so spatial coding, what it is in DD plus Jock and Dolby True HD, and I might have this on another slide, but I'll say it here, is in any given moment, you have 15 audio streams plus 1 audio stream for the LFE, 16 in total. Now, that's not for everything, but in most cases, like Apple Music, Tidal, not Amazon, because actually they're not delivering the DD plus Jock, but let's say Apple Music and Tidal for now, and then also Dolby True HD on Blu-rays. In any given moment, you essentially have 15 plus 1, which is 15 potential object cluster positions plus 1 discrete LFE. The LFE is always given 1. So in any given moment, you can actually only have 15 master cluster locations. But that's constantly updating. And as a result of it constantly updating, it still builds a really good picture of what we're used to listening to in our out of the renderer, which doesn't necessarily have to be subject to spatial coding. Very important to understand. Very important to understand, just to have clarity around the idea that beds and objects all become objects. Everything becomes an object. Everything is given positional metadata and is then subject to spatial coding as a part of the encoding process of creating DD plus Jock or True HD. Now, on the Tidal side, the AC4 IMS, I'll explain that shortly. It is not subject to spatial coding. Here is the image of what we use in the renderer to mimic spatial coding. We turn on spatial coding emulation. We choose the number of elements. 16 is the most appropriate for those of you working in music, unless you know of a specific instance where less is what's available, but 16 is the right setting. And the best practice here is to not have this on when we're building a mix, when we're building a production, because it's doing unnecessary information. It's doing a whole bunch of work that really doesn't matter until we get to the late stage when all the elements are present. If you just have 2 elements present at one time, then it's jumping around and doing a bunch of work that is actually not representative of what it will ultimately be. So typically you'd have this turned off until you have all the elements present. But if you're doing a project where you receive all the stems at once and you're listening to it all at once, then this definitely has to be on, because if you're listening without spatial coding, you are getting a false sense of detail and positionality. And you'll also notice that with spatial coding, you probably won't notice it. It's really intelligent, but there are times if you've got something spinning around the room in a really complicated mix with a lot of objects, and you start soloing things, you're going to hear it jump and snap in certain ways because it's having to navigate that complicated relationship. So, mix approaches in Atmos. This is important. Let me just see where we're going here. Yeah. This is essential to understand as a mastering engineer, because as we know, or as you're about to find out, or some of you know very well, to master content in this music from an ADM BWF file means getting the mix essentially delivered to you as a committed mix. And so I'll explore this later again, but the idea of understanding intimately how that mix was created and what is a must. You have to be able to do that perfectly to be able to start the process of mastering. You cannot just pull the file in and start doing your thing. You have to know exactly how that mix was built. And there are so many ways to approach a mix. And it's one of the most complicated things about mastering in this format, is that no 2 files are quite alike. Option 1, objects plus beds. The 712 bed is used for discrete channel position information, let's say effects or discrete channel audio, plus the LFE, of course, which is always in a bed, and then objects for anything in between the speakers. This is a pretty common one. Someone wants to put a lot of stuff just in the 7, and maybe they're using the 0.2, although I'm going to suggest against it, but regardless, they're using the bed. They've got a bunch of processing on the bed, and then using objects for things with movement or things that are in some specific positions that the bed doesn't make easy. Option 2, objects plus LFE bed. Objects for all audio and bed for LFE only. This has become very common. I've done all of these. I'll suggest which one I do as a mixer once I've read through them. This is very common. Make everything an object except the LFE, which can't be. Makes sense. People use, and then we come to this next one, which is sort of an expanded version of number 2. Create discrete channel routing positions using objects. That's an object bed. You can do 916, you could do 714, you could do anything as an object bed. And then separate objects for anything with movement or more specific placement outside of those discrete channel routing positions. And then bed for LFE only. So now you get a file. As a mastering engineer, I see a bed with just an LFE in it. Everything else is silent. Then I see that object bed. I can see, you have to be able to look at the file and be like, that's what that is. And then a whole bunch of objects that were intended for other purposes. Very, very common. I would say that this has become the most common, actually, from a mastering engineer perspective of what I've seen. Object bed plus objects plus bed. So beds used for discrete channel position information. So this means like you could put an immersive reverb, like a 7.0 immersive reverb plus the LFE. So you're still using the bed. Then you also create an object bed for discrete channel object-based placement of audio, not effects. And then separate objects for movement and more specific placement. So now you're getting into territories where you would have a template to make this happen. But that's probably the most flexible option that I can see right there. And then there's bed only. This is very uncommon in music, and for good reason. The issue, again, is that 0.2 is the height channels. It can create fold-down issues. So if you were doing bed, I would at least say that a quad object bed up top for front and rear height channels would be the way to go. Now, this is not intended to be a recommendation, although I did do it. And honestly, I've used so many of these as a mixer, and they all have their advantages. I'm definitely heavily object-based. LFE is on the bed, but the one thing is that I will oftentimes put reverbs, immersive reverbs, on the 7.0 in the bed, because there is absolutely no difference between the object being in a bed position for the reverb or an object. So what that does for me is it allows me to save 7 objects, or to keep my reverb and effects separate. Because when you use an object bed, you send multiple things to the same object location, which, like I said earlier, is sort of like a positional aux channel. As a mastering engineer later on, where I receive that ADM file and all the objects come in as separate audio, I'm going to explain later in this video, and yes, it will still be a little while, why I see massive benefits in separating audio, essentially a stem out, for my workflow as a mastering engineer. And we're going to get there. And there's just things that have to get clarified before we do it. So these are the mix approaches. If you're considering mastering Dolby Atmos content and this didn't make sense, you just sort of can't. If you get a mix from somebody and you can't immediately rebuild what that mix is from the ADM, you don't know where to start. You don't know how to move things around, how to process things. And we're going to clarify why that's the case. But this needs to be deeply, deeply understood. Visually, you need to see it for workflow and speed purposes. This is so integral because we are no longer receiving a 2-channel file where I know and you know that it was a stereo file, there's a left, there's a right, I treat it, I give it back to you. No, I need to know exactly how you built your mix in order to be able to even consider whether augmenting it is possible. Loudness. Loudness. It's fascinating. As a stereo mastering engineer of well over a decade myself, I have developed my own relationship with loudness, with LKFS or LUFS, and with peak levels and all that stuff. And before me, I mean, we have so many absolutely legendary mastering engineers in the world, in the stereo field, who have shared their knowledge, their experience, and most importantly, their beautiful masters with the world, and set that bar. And the exploration of the technicalities, even in the stereo mastering world today, are still evolving. And the stereo mastering world does not agree upon loudness, upon intersample peaks, upon peak levels, upon PLR. All of that stuff is still up for debate. Now, there are some very well-established, very prominent engineers who have strong opinions, many of which I align with, and I have my own strong opinions on the matter. But the fact is that in juxtaposition to the film world, which even though they also have their things and their complications, the one thing that they do have, which we don't, is at least a serious attempt at standardization of loudness. Now, it does change, and there have been major bumps along the road for them as well. But in the music world, it continues to essentially be a free-for-all. It shouldn't be. There's so many reasons that it shouldn't be. There's so many reasons why. I'm thinking about Ian Shepherd in this moment and all of the things around loudness. But at the same time, it still is what it is. We are where we are. And anyone who's putting out music today in a stereo capacity and considering commercial standards is aware of this dilemma. So bring in Atmos. Again, I started this 5 years ago. So I've been, film was before me, of course, but I started at a time where there literally was anything suggested about loudness to do with Atmos was just from film. And then very quickly as music got discussed and, suggestions were made and standards have been established, but also massive, oh my gosh, in the early days especially, there were just complete misunderstandings around the whole thing. And still to this day, there are so many misunderstandings. I'm going to get into some of them. First things to understand, and this one for the Atmos engineers, you're going to understand this. But if someone's watching this who maybe is not an engineer, but maybe someone interested in creating the music, you got to get this. Dolby Atmos cannot reach the same LUFS as stereo while maintaining sonic fidelity. And this is due to summing. Summing, the idea of taking multiple streams of audio and squishing them into less streams. So when we are working in, let's just say 714, I'll just take the base level, even though I'm working in a higher channel count than that. When we have audio that is coming in at a certain loudness, let's take our famous -18 LKFS just for point of discussion. And we then sum that down to 6 channels, 5.1, or we sum that down to stereo. The loudness and the buildup of loudness is going to go up. It's just how it's going to be. You've got to squish more content into less space. And so therefore, having an Atmos master read -6 LUFS, and I'm not suggesting that stereo mastering engineers, I'm not advocating for or against, but they exist. You can do it. It won't sound good and it won't be a pleasurable experience. I don't care what loudness war you're attempting to win. It's not going to be something that anyone enjoys. I've tried just slamming it because you should just see what happens when you're learning and you're developing an aesthetic. You need to know the extremes. And so it's just important to remember as well that -18 LKFS with 14 speakers does not feel the same as -18 LKFS with 2 speakers. It's a different paradigm. Our sense of loudness is different. Our sense of what is of power and when sound is coming from potentially, and I say potentially because it doesn't have to come from around us to be Atmos, but when sound is potentially coming from around us, the human experience, we don't really desire this epic, crushing loudness. It's just not something that is pleasing, in the same way as sometimes a good, hot, solid stereo master can sort of just feel just right. It's a different paradigm. It's a different aesthetic. It's a different feeling. And so we're comparing apples to oranges when we're comparing numbers, and that's so important to understand. So Atmos can be played back from something like 916 all the way down to stereo and binaural. And this means that up to 15 channels of audio need to be simultaneously capable of playing on that many speakers and 2 speakers all at the same time. This creates loudness buildup, as I just said, and makes something like -9 LKFS unrealistic. It's just unrealistic, and the sonic fidelity cannot be maintained while doing it. As a result, Dolby Atmos's loudness range is lower. It's just lower. It's just by the virtue of its massive summing capabilities, it must be lower. Now, everyone knows, and I'll clarify again, the way that loudness is measured in this format is based on a specific 5.1 re-render that the Dolby Atmos renderer is creating. Dolby decided that a 5.1 is the center of this thing, right? Because there is no defined channel count. So Dolby said, let's make a 5.1 re-render. It's a specific thing. I'll discuss this when we get into Dialnorm shortly and clarify it. That 5.1 render is what is being used to develop the Dolby Atmos LKFS and peak values. So it's actually a sum. If you're working in 714, it's actually a sum of what you're working on that is creating the loudness dial norm. So as a result, Dolby Atmos has the ability to play back quieter in relation to lots of stereo content. Therefore, Dolby Atmos music must coexist with normalization to function in a consumer world. So normalization practices define the user experience with this format. And as a result, they have been integrated at the very core of Dolby Atmos. Normalization in the stereo world is still something that many people fight for to have as a mandatory, but some people turn it off, some people don't have it, not every environment has it, and so the loudness wars don't fully stop because there's so many arguments against, not every consumer is using it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And on the Atmos side, Atmos was already defined with Dialnorm and loudness parameters and rigid metadata capabilities from the onset, at least from the film world. I don't know exactly when they put it in, but it's been there, and for good reason. And so when we receive it in the music side, normalization was already built into and sort of an expected part of the delivery and experience of Dolby Atmos music. Now, that said, if you turn Soundcheck off on Apple, and then you play a stereo master and a Dolby Atmos master, the differentiation in volume is too much. It's too much to be, I hate the idea of competitive, but it's too much to even be a reasonable comparison for any listener. So for Dolby Atmos to coexist, normalization of stereo content and Atmos content to find a center medium is a must. And therefore, we have to understand normalization deeply because it is a part of the success criteria and delivery of this music. So now we come to Dialnorm, dialogue normalization. Dialnorm is a parameter carried in all Dolby Atmos bit streams. It carries the measured integrated loudness. The peak level metadata, which is a true peak reading, is carried in as a separate informational piece of metadata. The Dialnorm includes the integrated LKFS plus the true peak level, which is generated from a 5.1 render. And that is based on the 5.1 monitoring mode and applied trims. So there's, that is, as a result, like if I change trims and if I change my render mode, that will also affect this. And therefore, those things need to be all established properly. We're going to clarify that with downmix and trims, etc. But that's important to note. And it is post-spatial coding limiter. I'll clarify what that all is in subsequent slides. But the 5.1 loudness render is post-spatial coding limiter. The stereo and binaural integrated LKFS and true peak value are generated from the binaural re-render. This is also post-limiter. It is also affected by the stereo and downmix trim settings and binaural settings. The binaural settings affect the loudness measurement of a binaural side, and the downmix trim settings affect the loudness reading of the stereo side. That's if you turn on or off headphone processing. Now, the binaural limiter. And I'm going to go deeper into this one because it is deeply misunderstood and abused often. The binaural limiter, the limiting is not applied to the master. It is there to mimic what will be applied by the Dolby Media encoder downstream. So, Dialnorm must be measured using the offline loudness measurement in the Dolby Atmos production suite or the Dolby Atmos mastering suite or the new production suite that's been released. No matter what program, no matter if you're doing offline rendering here, there, whatever, in order to get the actual accurate render or the actual Dialnorm information, you have to load the ADM into the renderer or the mastering suite, etc., and take a loudness reading from the renderer. That is the only way to know for sure that that is the actual metadata that's going to be carried with that file. Now, the LKFS and the true peak are equally important in regard to normalization downstream. Let's look into this. Let's unpack this for a little bit. I'm hoping you can see. I know that I'm already plus 45 minutes in, and I'm not done. But I'm hoping that you can see why, like this, it's complicated, it's dense, and there's so much to understand and explore before we can even consider putting an EQ on something or talking about why there's no bus processing. Like it's so much deeper than that. And it is understanding this that helps the right decisions to get made downstream. Dialnorm, dial log normalization. So I already got into this. The loudness range. This is the LRA of program material. So this is the loudness range here. The following are not pertinent to music. The integrated Dialnorm is the integrated loudness measurement with dialogue gating applied in LKFS. That is something that we don't need to think about in music. It's very important on the film and television side because they use dialogue. Many situations use dialogue loudness as the measured loudness rather than integrated loudness. The speech percentage, this is the percentage of speech within the program that is calculated by the speech detection algorithm, also not pertinent to music. So what we really need to be thinking about here is our integrated loudness, our true peak value. You can look at short-term and momentary as well, but really our integrated loudness is the measurement that is going to affect normalization, and our true peak is going to also affect normalization. The spatial coding limiter. Limiting is not applied to the master. This mimics what will be applied by the Dolby Media encoder downstream. Here's a question that I'm going to ask you to, especially for an engineer who has never sent something to a mastering engineer. I want you to answer this question for yourself honestly. Have you quality checked your files in the Dolby Media encoder before delivering them to a client or for distribution? If you have not, it's not an emergency, but it means that you have not truly ever heard the exact way that that file is going to be treated, especially if you were engaging any limiting aspects used in the renderer. Soft clipping. So this can be turned on or off, also not contained within the actual encode. It's not contained in the file. It is just an emulation, and it's just something in this case to save our ears and speakers, the soft limiter. The binaural and headphone limiter, also not applied to the master. It mimics what will be applied by the Dolby Media encoder downstream in the AC4 IMS. This is the one that matters the most. We're going to get to it. Let's clarify what the DD plus JOC file is. So the DD plus JOC, or Joint Object Coding, Dolby Digital Plus Joint Object Coding, is used for consumer speaker playback. It is channel adaptive, as we've already established. It's spatially coded with 15 cluster positions at any given moment, plus 1 for the LFE, so 16 audio streams in any given moment. It's lossy, so it is a lossy format, and we have a range of kilobits per second, so we have constant bit rate of from between 448 and 768, and it is spatially coded. It can also handle speaker formats when the ADM or Atmos are not the source. This is fascinating. The Dolby Digital Plus format can also just handle and be a delivery format for 5.1 or 7.1, which is important to understand. So it's been used before, but in the Atmos context, we can ignore that one for now. Joint Object Coding uses an advanced perceptual model, masking principles, to allocate bits to objects dynamically on a frame-by-frame basis. There we go. Earlier, I sort of forgot. It's frame by frame. It's on a frame basis. It is using an advanced perceptual model, masking principles, to dynamically shift all of the various clusters. The Dolby Digital Plus JOC file does not carry the binaural metadata. So for instance, early on we recognized, and still to this day, that Apple's spatial audio format does not use binaural metadata. If anyone was in this at the beginning, everyone was up in arms. And Apple, my conversations with Buddy at Apple, which I was very grateful for, he clarifies, like, well, we're using DD plus JOC to create our stuff, and it's not that they chose not to use it. I mean, they chose not to use AC4 IMS for sure, but by choosing to use DD plus JOC as their file type to develop their spatial audio ecosystem, it's actually the DD plus JOC file that doesn't carry the binaural metadata. It's not available there. It's not a part of it. That binaural metadata is only carried on the AC4 IMS side. And so Apple would have had to follow suit with Tidal and also basically paid for all of the decoding of the AC4 IMS just for headphone and immersive speaker playback, and then DD plus JOC for speaker playback in order to maintain that binaural metadata. But since they only chose to use the DD plus JOC, it wasn't as simple as them just throwing the binaural metadata out. It was just that that's not a part of that audio stream. Minus 18 LUFS is the recommendation. It is a recommendation for this format. And minus 1 true peak is the minimum headroom required to avoid engaging playback limiters. That happens post-encode and normalization. That is the one that truly matters. The LUFS is something, I'll explore it. It's going to get explored at multiple points in this conversation, and we'll go deeper every time. But the true peak is really what matters. And so if you understand what PLR is, peak loudness ratio, that's actually the most important aspect, not that minus 18 number that everyone is so heavily fixated on. So Tidal and Apple use the DD Plus jock for their speaker playback. That happens on an Apple TV 4K, HDMI into a receiver playback. It happens with an AVR, that's the receiver. I have an Arvis unit, the H24D, where I can receive that DD Plus jock file and then send that via Dante or Matty to my Avid Matrix, and then I can have a digital version without any extra conversion to listen to consumer content. There's also the Trinnov Altitude, a really fancy device that is also doing room tuning and is providing consumers and some mastering engineers that I know with converters. So that's a heavy unit that is also capable of decoding that and giving it for speaker playback. The MP4 render from the renderer that we export is a DD Plus jock file. That is why we can import it into the iPhone, we can import it into iTunes, and then decode it as though it was an Atmos deliverable, because it is a DD Plus jock file. That's what's happening at the encode stage when you encode it on the back end of the renderer. Tidal uses DD Plus jock for speaker playback, and they were the first one on the music side. Anyone who was in this early enough, Tidal did it at least a year before Apple. And so I was able to listen to content early on, those first mixes that came out over the Apple TV into an AVR for me at that time. And that's all DD Plus jock. And the normalization for this file is defined by Dolby and the decoder being at the device level. So on an Apple TV, content is actually normalized down to -31 LUFS during the decode, which is an expected input level for AVRs and soundbars. And all of that stuff has been defined by the television and the film industry. And what this does is it ensures maximum headroom for the playback device so that you can turn it up and there's just no risks for clipping or unnecessary limiting. And it also, again, in the television and movie world, they're very, very focused on trying to have consistent loudness so that users are not constantly using and complaining about having to turn things up and turn things down, and also maybe damage their equipment if something's too loud, or wake up their family at night if they're watching something and then suddenly the commercial's way too loud. And so that's why all of this Dialnorm content was initiated, because that world is so focused on it. Where the music side, we're getting the benefits of it, but it wasn't really the music side that influenced it. Although I would like to see our needs on the music side continue to now have a real seat at the table for the future of how normalization affects Dolby Atmos content, to put that out there. So Apple Music and the DD Plus jock. The process, this is for the speaker playback. The ADM BWF is delivered to Apple. They use the Dolby Media encoder, same one that other consumers or other content creators can have, to generate the DD Plus jock. Apple then uses the DD Plus jock for the Apple TV 4K speaker-based playback. When soundcheck is on, it will be normalized up to -16 LKFS, but it will not cross a -1 true peak. Therefore, if a file is delivered at -18 LUFS with a -3 decibel true peak, it will normalize to -16 LKFS. If a file is delivered at -18 LKFS with a -1 true peak, it will not be turned up. If soundcheck is off, none of that normalization happens. For those of you who understand the numbers, this is an area where PLR, loudness, and actually peak value has the most bearing on the normalization of a file. Apple Music plus DD Plus jock into spatial audio, and spatial audio being the headphone-based or immersive speaker-based ecosystem that Apple has created and is continuing to pour incredible energy into, and has created quite an inspiring ecosystem. Apple headphones plus an iOS speaker based playback device use DD plus jock. So this is the headphone side. The process, which has been misunderstood for far too long, but although it's been clarified at important junctures for anyone who is really looking. The ADM BWF is delivered to Apple. Apple then uses the Dolby media encoder to generate the DD plus jock. Apple then uses the Dolby OAR, the object audio renderer, to generate a 714 render. The DD plus jock is spatially coded. Remember that. So they're not creating a 7.4 render from the ADM. They're creating a 7.4 render from the spatially coded DD plus jock. That's a big deal in some cases, especially for heavily object-based productions. Anyone who's ever compared an ADM to a DD plus jock directly will know what that means. So the 714 render is created. Apple now normalizes the 714 render up to -16 LKFS, but will not cross a -1 decibel true peak, the same practice we saw on the Apple TV 4K side. Therefore, the same principle that if a file is delivered at -18 LKFS with a -3 decibel true peak as its peak value Dialnorm information, it will normalize to -16. If a file is delivered at -18 with a -1 decibel true peak, it will not be turned up. I like that Apple decided to do this. I love that Apple will not push content into limiting or additional compression. I think that it is a brilliant system. I think that it should be adopted far and wide. It ensures headroom for playback. It ensures that there's no additional limiting taking place that has not been approved or tested by artists, producers, mixers, and mastering engineers. There is, however, some potential for discrepancy in loudness based on PLR. Not much, and I'll share more on my own relationship with this as we go on. Apple have started to integrate binaural metadata now into their own headphone renders, which are intended for non-head tracking devices. This is important because for those who are not using AirPods, AirPod Maxes, or AirPod Pros, AirPod Maxes, it means that you are now getting close to an AC4 IMS, which we're going to explore in a second, which is the equivalent to the Dolby headphone render, the binaural headphone render that we can listen to in real time. It is not one-to-one. And that is because it's not actually Dolby's, to my knowledge, it is not actually Dolby's own binaural headphone algorithms, mid, near, far, but rather Apple's ecosystem for it. So they are using those settings to affect each object in their own headphone render for non-head tracked devices. But that also leads to some complications on the level of translation. So this is big, right? This is because Apple's integration of spatial audio is no doubt the biggest current player when it comes to getting Dolby Atmos content into the real world. I want you to ask yourself a question, especially to a mixer who has written off the concept of mastering. Did you know this information? And have you released content having known or misunderstood anything crucial in what I just described? If so, I'm just going to put it out there that it is in the stereo world as well. It's one of the mastering engineer's largest responsibilities to be intimately connected to all of this information, and when it changes, to know it before anybody. because we are obsessed with translation. We are obsessed with creating and trying to understand the best possible way to deliver that art successfully. And success means what we intended is what's being experienced. And so there's a whole bunch of information there that if you misunderstood, and my question is, does a mixer really need to be thinking about all of this in real time? When you were working in stereo, are these the types of things informationally that you are thinking about when trying to make a great stereo mix? I don't think so. AC4 IMS, an immersive stereo codec. That's what the IMS is. It was used originally in Android phones for Atmos playback on Tidal. I got an Android phone early on just so that I could experience it before Tidal ended up adopting or delivering on iOS. Now used by Amazon and Tidal for Android and iOS Atmos headphone and phone speaker playback. So when you listen to something on your iPhone and you're listening to Atmos content, it is not a stereo render. It is the immersive stereo experience that's being created for your phone. And so how that happens is the AC4 IMS is a 2-channel bit stream that carries the binaural render mode metadata to be able to build the binaural headphone experience that is one-to-one. It's like almost one-to-one, but it's one-to-one with what we experience in the renderer. I'll describe what the differences though are, and a couple of them might shock you. It's to do with loudness and normalization. But anyways, consider it for now for all intents and purposes, one-to-one. That's our binaural headphone experience on Amazon or Tidal. But the immersive stereo experience, it's not just a baked binaural file. It's a stereo bit stream that when headphones are engaged, accesses the binaural render metadata. But when speakers are engaged, that binaural render metadata is essentially not accessed. And now we have this immersive stereo mix to listen to, or this immersive stereo deliverable. Very intelligent. AC4 IMS is powerful. Right now, everybody's focused on Apple. I mean, I'm focused on Apple. I love Apple. I love what they do with it. I love working with the tools. This is not an ad, but I'm not alone in this department. If, and I'll say when, but if and when Spotify takes on Dolby Atmos, I have no knowledge here, so I'm going out on a limb. I would be shocked, because Spotify is interested in playing back on every type of device, not just Apple devices. I would be shocked if they didn't use AC4 IMS. It just makes sense. Just like Tidal, just like Amazon. To use Apple's Spatial Codec, they would need to only use it on iPhones, of course, or iOS devices. So they'd still need to have a non-iOS device version, right? Like you only get to experience Apple Music on an Apple device. So my own hypothetical here is that the AC4 IMS, if Spotify takes this on, and I say when, this is going to be the most important format in all of Dolby Atmos, right? Spotify's listenership is the largest. Now, if they do a paid tier for it, that could affect that discussion. Personally, I'm going to really go out on a limb here. This is personal. I love the Apple Spatial algorithm. I enjoy what it does to my masters, my mixes. I like listening to my AirPod Pros and my AirPod Maxes. I love it. And I actually wish that we would just adopt that all around, and then that just became our headphone experience. I know that not everyone's with me on that, but I will say that confidently. As a personal listener, as someone who's listening in an incredible speaker system all the time, I love the philosophy and approach behind it. I'll be shocked, and hey, If that happens, great. Like whatever happens, it's all good. But I'll be shocked if Spotify doesn't take on AC4 IMS. And as a result, understanding AC4 IMS, it could potentially, if it's not a paid stream at Spotify, become the master Dolby Atmos headphone format overnight. I mean, Amazon Tidal already have it. It sounds great. I love listening to it there as well. And obviously it's closest to what's being created in the renderer in real time. So that's why this is really, really, really important. And this is why thinking ahead into the future is really important. And there are some who will say, oh, let's just focus only on Apple. They're the only ones. But okay, maybe today, I mean, yes, their listenership over Tidal and Amazon is huge, and Apple's the one putting the energy in. And again, I'm just grateful to it. I love what Buddy does there. I love what Carrie has joined that team. Like they have done incredible things sonically, philosophically for the format. I'm all for it. But that's no reason to sleep on the AC4 IMS. That's a terrible, terrible mistake for the Spotify potential alone, let alone the fact that it's Dolby's format. It's the one that's connected to and generated from their ecosystem. So AC4 IMS is not subject to spatial coding and clustering, which is fascinating. The way that it's created is right from the ADM and right from the objects themselves. There's no spatial coding going on. Now we get into some loudness stuff. This might shock you a little bit. To generate AC4 IMS, the binaural Dialnorm is used. This means that when we go to the binaural side of the renderer, that integrated loudness and that true peak value is what is defining the Dialnorm and defining how normalization plays back for an AC4 IMS file. What they do is that any audio louder than -16 LUFS is attenuated to -16 before encoding. This creates headroom. The Dialnorm value in the bit stream is then set to -16 when that occurs. What happens then is AC4 IMS is then normalized to the pre-specified level on the playback device. -14 is the most common playback device level for AC4 IMS. And limiting is applied at the decode stage in order to reach this target. This is the limiting that is mimicked in the Atmos renderer. But that limiting in the Atmos renderer is not an exact representation of the user experience, as loudness normalization is not applied in the Atmos renderer. The binaural limiter in the renderer, this is important, it is a true peak oversampled limiter. That does mean that the limiting at the decode stage is usually a little bit less sensitive. So let me say this last statement and then I'm going to unpack this, is in order to properly QC the AC4 IMS, one must use an Android device that properly supports Dolby Atmos, like the Samsung S21 as an example, or the Dolby reference player, in which you will identify the target loudness to experience the precise sonic experience. Here's the Dolby reference player. I'm going to ask an honest question for you to answer for yourself. Have you ever checked the AC4 IMS at -14 LUFS in the Dolby reference player to truly experience how it will sound before it goes to streaming? If you haven't, and then you have ever been surprised by your own file, this is why. Let's talk about this a bit more. Now, especially, I'm not saying that that's always a bad thing, and I'm not saying that the limiter is not clean and does not do a great job. I will say this, as a stereo mastering engineer, the idea, the notion of delivering a master to you where there is going to be a mysterious limiting process going to take place that I have no control over, is just not acceptable. Let's say you call me. You're like, okay, Justin, I'd like you to master this song. I send it back to you, and you say, okay, is this the final loudness? I say, no, it's a little quiet, but don't worry, it'll get louder. Okay, can I hear it that way? No, you'll hear it once it gets to streaming. Well, how does it get louder? Your peak value is already at 0. Oh, the streaming service will limit it for you. Don't worry about it. It will be fine. Does that sound like an acceptable arrangement? The answer is no. The answer is a hard no. It's also a hard no on the Atmos side to me. It always has been. The minute I understood this, that there is a document out there that suggests that binaural limiting is okay in the renderer. And I'm not saying that it sounds necessarily bad, although if you've developed a proper ear for limiters, it is not a limiter. Look, I love Dolby. I love everything they do. You know that. But I wouldn't buy the Atmos renderer spatial coding limiter to slap on any masters anytime soon. It's not a limiter that I would like to use. I'd much rather use my arsenal of insane mastering limiters over that if I could. It is there as a fail-safe. It is not there as a real mastering tool, and in many cases it has been used as such. And then you read that someone's disappointed in how the translation sounds. Well, this is I'm continuing to build the story here around the necessity of mastering in this format and the necessity of understanding this stuff so well so that there are no surprises, so that when an artist hears something on Tidal or on Amazon or on Apple or on speakers or on a soundbar or on a Sonos system, that it's always good, always. There's no preferred format. This is all about sonic averaging. And part of that is having control over all of these parameters and letting a file into the world that's already got limiting, and then it's going to get even more mystery limiting. It's not mystery limiting because you can check it. But if you've never checked it before, that's just unacceptable. From a mastering standpoint, it's not acceptable. So this is a part of developing the ecosystem and the knowledge around why we need to develop this practice. Let's look at this file. So we've got -14 LKFS and a -0.6 true peak. This is on the binaural loudness side, right? So this file would be attenuated down 2 dB to reach -16 LUFS pre-encode. The Dialnorm would then be set there the file would be said to be -16. And this would yield a -2.6 decibel true peak. This means that on an Android device that normalizes to -14 or Amazon or Tidal, it's going to yield a playback where it's going to go back up to -14 with a -0.6 true peak. Bam! This means that the file will not engage any of the playback limiters, and it will essentially be one-to-one with the binaural render from the renderer. What happens if this file, and you know you've been there, is on the binaural side at let's call it -15.6 with a +0.2 true peak? Well, let's do the math. Gets turned down 0.4, so now we've got a -16 LUFS delivery. That's the Dialnorm. And then it would have a -0.2 true peak. But then it gets normalized up to -14, meaning that we have a +1.8 true peak. Pretty sure I got that math wrong. My apologies if I didn't. 1.8 decibels of limiting. It's not going to clip. Dolby's got you. 1.8 decibels of limiting. Now, if that's okay, and I've checked it with the media player, and I've decided consciously that based on all the factors, this is the most appropriate way to go, great. But if you've never checked that, just because there was a document somewhere that said it's okay to have binaural clipping, that's not good. That's not sustainable practice, and it's definitely not in line with how stereo mastering engineers think about this. And let's be frank, the stereo mastering engineer side has thought about this. Now, it's also not in line with how the immersive audio mastering engineers, who are some of the finest engineers in the world, creating some of the engineers who are working at full DSD, unbelievable multi-channel recordings, they're not sending files into the world that can be limited in some mysterious process. So, I'm pretty passionate about this one, and I have been for a long time. And whatever that document out there that says that it's okay, it's not. It's just not. Unless you have confirmed for yourself that it is as a mastering engineer. Then you can say, I have consciously made this decision that I have confirmed that that amount of limiting is suiting this material. Just the same as if I'm working on stereo content and I'm pushing into that limiter a little bit harder, making that decision, saying, this is serving this music. I do want to reduce the dynamic range by 1.8 decibels. But to have that happen as a mystery process, no. Tidal plus Amazon on the AC4RMS. What they're doing here is, I've explained this already, that the AC4RMS is virtualized for speaker playback on Android. It's decoded on the device. The Android phones themselves had chips in them. Where on the iOS side, when they both took on iOS, it's actually decoded pre-device within the actual software on their side. So, yeah, same with Amazon. It's decoded pre-device. They ended up putting the technology and sort of doing all that stuff before. That way, because the reason we didn't have Tidal on a phone for so long is the iPhone didn't have the AC4IMS decoding chip. It still doesn't. And therefore, Tidal needed to develop their app to be able to do it for us. Normalization is defined by Dolby and the device, not by the services. And this explains why some headphone renders play back differently than their stereo partners on Tidal and Amazon. So, that's a lot. That's a lot of information. That's a lot of everyone has just been saying, hit -18, -1, everything's fine. It's just not true. Painting by numbers has never served stereo. It never will. And doing it in this format, I mean, I've said it sort of loud before, but there are so many more considerations around loudness than just hitting a number. And I see it too often, the idea of you hit -18, -1, doesn't need to be mastered, it's already done. Well, first of all, loudness is just one component of mastering, which I'll explore in detail as we continue to go forward. But second of all, that's also just not true, based on a whole bunch of information that I hope I've been able to make clear here. We're getting there. We're getting to the mastering side, but it's all mastering. It's all part of the considerations. Dolby True HD. This is a lossless format used for Blu-ray currently. Binaural is not a concern. Doesn't carry binaural metadata, nor does Dolby True HD get experienced on headphones ever. Blu-ray players don't really have headphone outs, so it's not really a thing. The difference here as well is it's not a perceptual model, but rather it's a mathematically compressing the audio using entropy coding. I say that with confidence. I don't fully have that statement. I couldn't explain to you exactly what that was. Dolby provided that for me. But I think what it essentially means is that their spatial coding method is a higher quality here than it is in the DD plus jock. It requires 10 times the bitrate of a DD plus jock. -18 is the recommendation and -1 is the recommendation. But the same situation applies here. And actually, it's not necessarily going to be normalized when it's on a Blu-ray. Dependent on the AVR and dependent on what's downstream. no limiting or normalization is applied during encoding unless the spatial coding limiter is applied. And the spatial coding limiter is going to be applied if you've crossed that -1 true peak. So really the spatial coding limiter for both DD+ Jock and Dolby True HD is essentially a non-factor for all of us, because I think it's very clear that nobody is pushing past or even allowing files to get delivered into the world without a -1 true peak. So that's essentially removing the spatial coding limiter from the equation. If you were to deliver a file to go to Dolby True HD that was above -1, then the spatial coding limiter would kick in, which would be, a problem by my count. True HD also includes channel-based renders in the bit stream. It can have a 7.1, a 5.1, and a stereo within the same bit stream. Very cool. These have limiting applied to prevent overload in rendering and downmixing. If the Dialnorm is set correctly, it allows the encoder to scale these downmixes without any limiting. So if you've never made, Dolby True HD is outside of the purview of many people's considerations, but it won't be forever. It's the best consumer format we have for Dolby Atmos at the moment. I have a large Blu-ray collection. The encoding of Dolby True HD is its own sort of art, and understanding it is very important. And it's going to become more important over time. And this is another area, again, where making these decisions around the translation, around normalization practices, etc., is just so key. Here, maybe less prevalent right now if you're not going to Blu-ray, but mastering is not just for streaming, right? Dolby Atmos is not just for streaming. This is a format that can go far and wide, and so I'm trying to look at it through that lens. This slide is here again just to remind us, check out some music. Okay, let's pause. I'm looking at the clock. 1:27 of technical information. All that technical information is mandatory to understand before we can consider what is now going to be the discussion on the mastering practices. That might actually remind someone that, you know what, I'd rather have a mastering engineer deal with all this stuff, because also this presentation probably going to be different a year from now. Things are changing fast. But if somebody is putting their own music out into the world and that went over your head, then the ensuring of the end user experience, you are leaving a lot to chance. And I'm just going to put that out there. And that's just a fact of working within the complexities of this beautiful sonic ecosystem. So, mastering. The big picture here. It's the art of finalizing. It's communicating with the full production team to fully realize an artistic vision. Oftentimes, the mastering engineer is the one to talk to artists, mixers, producers, labels, and distribution channels all at once. It's creating final deliverables for a music production. It's the art of offering perspective to a production. It is a critical listening practice. It is understanding deeply the listener ecosystem for translation, right? Which is what this whole journey up until now has been all about. It requires having confident and a diverse sense of sonic aesthetics. To be a mastering engineer, you have to be absolutely confident, but also flexible at the same time with what your aesthetic preferences are. It's the only way to make those decisions. It's a technical practice, but it's also an instinctual practice. The technicalities are important. They determine the success of that translation, of that delivery. But the instinctual part is a feeling-based, reactionary process of listening to something and knowing instantly what you want to do with it And that is based on your aesthetics. It's based on your experience. It's based on everything and all the knowledge that I've discussed up till now. It has to sort of be there, but also fade away at the same time, because it is a sonic art and it is a reactionary art. But all of those decisions that you make in real time need to also serve the technical side. Otherwise, even if you make a decision, you're going to be going up against the technology and introducing problems. It's refining the balance and creating and cohesion in the pursuit of translation. It's the final stage of QC. Some of the best mixes I've received have still needed a click or a pop removed. Because when you're mixing, you're in a different world. You need to be. You need to let go. You need to be in a fully creative headspace. And so those little details get past us. And they get past artists because we just need that fresh set of ears. And it's definitely using all of this to reach the appropriate technical standards of loudness, metadata, etc. Mastering is not defined by bus processing, limiting, making program material louder, adding air and width. These are certainly common techniques used in mastering, but they do not define the practice. I'll ask this little hypothetical. If one is to apply limiting to their mix, does it make them a mastering engineer? You can answer that. If I answer it, the answer is no. I receive mixes all the time as a stereo mastering engineer where there's clearly been some peak limiting. I usually request one without, but quite frankly, whatever someone delivers as what them and the artist have confirmed is, if that's the file to be worked on, that's the file to be worked on. Part 2, if the same limited mix is released, is it the master? Yes. But was it mastered? Well, now we get into our I'll let you answer that question. I would say the answer is no on an easy side. It wasn't mastered by, consciously. But technically speaking, even if nothing's done, then that was the mastering process. So I would just argue that it was mastered without care or mastered without intent. But that's just my answer. I'd like you to answer for yourself. Atmos mastering is mix adjacent from a technical standpoint. The mastering role here has evolved and it has changed, but the primary goals have remained the exact same. Mastering does currently share software, tools, techniques, and layouts with mixing and with mix engineers. This could change in the future, but it's where we're at right now. That's one of the reasons that it's mix adjacent, and it's one of the contributing factors to, I think, that the mixing world. Look, I'm a mixer. I mix more than I master in this format. But I master everything that I do consciously. That's what I'm going to get towards here. And I really love mastering for other engineers and want to see the ecosystem like stereo evolve to the point where we get those multiple points to take every production all the way. That's what I'm advocating for. In order to master music in this format, one must have a deep and practical understanding of how music is mixed. There's no way around it. If somebody is coming into a stereo mastering engineer who sees all the energy around Dolby Atmos and has never opened a mix session and doesn't know half of what I just said, it can't work, because it's, in order to master this content at this particular stage in time, you have to be doing so many things like a mix engineer. The practice is totally mix adjacent. We're going to get there as to why. It's to do with the file, it's to do with objects, it's to do with the delivery of adaptive audio. But it's just fundamentally different than stereo in that regard specifically. And so to be able to successfully master it, I cannot imagine a situation where you do not understand exactly how it's mixed and understand all the considerations and all the tools, because you have to, as a mastering engineer, create a relationship with all those parts. There's no way around it. I will say, on the stereo side, there's nothing more beautiful than just receiving a stereo mix for mastering. You don't need to know. I don't care if they used summing or if, it sounds good. These are the things I want to do to it. It's just two sides of a file, two discrete, channels left and right, and off to the races. Now, stem mastering exists there, and let me get there later. Atmos is not that. It's different, and it has to be. What do we deliver for Atmos mastering? Well, we deliver an ADM BWF mix file, a confirmed mix, just the same as with mixing in stereo. Realistically, you should be delivering something that you feel is done. When someone's delivering in stereo, you should be delivering to your mastering engineer something that you feel like, I don't know how, you should really have the feeling of like, I don't even know what they're going to do because I think this is so good. That's the kind of feeling you want to have. Now, in the stereo world, I would typically request if they had done a full-scale limited version to provide an unlimited version, and most stereo engineers and producers oblige, but not always, and whatever, we move forward. In this case, the same attitude should exist. This is done. I don't know what Justin's going to do because I think this is perfect, but have at it. That should be the attitude of delivering that ADM file. It needs to be confirmed. It needs to be and then I need a confirmed, sample-accurate, high-res stereo master. Where applicable, if it's 4416, that's fine. MP3, no, get the wave. Ideally, a 4824 master or above, 9624 if that's available, and beyond, of course. And then on my side, where possible, with the engineers that I work on regularly, they'll send me a PTX session with the binaural settings plugin in it. And I use this, for anyone who understands, it helps me to then, I import that into my session before I import the ADM, and it just helps with a whole bunch of technicalities. I'm not going to go deep into that. You can also just you can use the binaural plugin to pull the metadata, to pull those binaural render modes off of the ADM. It's just an extra step. But at a bare minimum, I need the ADM BWF file. If there's a stereo master that it needs to match, because that already exists, I need a confirmed sample-accurate stereo master. That's the minimum. Now, discrete channel audio files is also a consideration here. Atmos is not just a format for contemporary object-based music production. There are many situations. I will take the great Morten Lindberg as an example, who will record an 11-channel array, 7 and 4, and then place each of those in what could be seen to be an object bed to a degree, but just discrete object channel placement. I've done it myself with many projects. And so that discrete channel production was actually made outside of Atmos, let's say in Pyramix with DSD or something along those lines. And then a channel render is delivered to a mastering engineer. Let's take a good colleague, friend of mine, Michael Romanowski, as an example. I know projects where he's worked in this capacity. Darcy Proper, another incredible mastering engineer, who's worked on tons of like 5.1 content, 7.1 content, discrete channel content. Her colleague and mix partner, Ronald Prent, works in discrete channel all the time, from things that he's shared in presentations and in times that we've discussed with each other. So the idea of delivering a channel-based render, let's say a 714, and then the mastering engineer just placing it in Atmos and then mastering it in the format, but actually it was created outside. So that's a discrete audio delivery, common to classical music, but also common to mixers who like to work that way, where Atmos is actually just going to be used as the delivery container. But in my case, the files that I'm receiving most commonly are ADM BWF mix files. How do we get started? What to do? The first thing is I listen to that ADM. I put it in the renderer and I listen to it. I take note of the Dialnorm, of loudness, and is it peaking the binaural? What's the LKFS? I need to know all that stuff before I start because it tells me about where the file's at. I do the same in stereo. I want to know where it's at. I want to know if it's peaking. I want to know what to set it to hit my gear properly on the analog domain. Most importantly, though, is that I need to understand the intent. I need to listen to it and understand the style, the approach, and I need to know the goal. Where is it going? Is this going to streaming? Is it going to Blu-ray? Is it going to a cinematic situation? I'm not going to unpack that too much, but I'm obsessed, and actually in Toronto there's going to be a release of something that I mixed and mastered for cinematic in mind, and then we went to a remix stage and made an MXF, and now there's a DCP, and it's going to be played back in a movie theater. Full Atmos music plus video production. If that's the intent, I need to know that because there are massive considerations around loudness and normalization that may or may not be a factor in various capacities. We'll keep it simple to streaming for now, but like in most contexts when I'm discussing it, but all of these are factors for a mastering engineer. The idea of just being a mastering engineer only working on streaming-based Dolby Atmos content because that's the most quote-unquote common, well, no, like that's just one avenue. I need to know the source material. Was it a spatial remix, i.e. was stereo done first? I need to identify what's the setting here. Are we trying to create something realistic? Are we trying to create something hyper-real? Is it meant to be very stereo-like, stereo plus? If there is a stereo master, I need to listen to that, and I need to understand now what the relationship between these two is. And once I've identified all of that information, then I can, for myself, instinctually identify the refinement areas and also the best approach. And I'm going to say the path of least resistance. I'll come back to that because there are so many ways to go about doing this, and it is so hyper flexible. And my goal is to find the path of least resistance for time, but also for impact. The philosophy of a mastering engineer is always to honor what comes to them. When I receive something, I know that the artist and the mixer love that thing, and I love it, and I want to just help it reach its full potential. And the path of least resistance is almost always the best way to get there. So in Atmos mastering with import to Pro Tools, I need to retrieve those binaural settings. I need to prepare a Pro Tools sessions with binaural settings and the I/O correctly done. Then import the ADM, import the stereo master where applicable. I'm going to stress this one right here. Oh my goodness. For anybody working as a mastering engineer in this format, we could have a little, we should have a little forum where we can air our grievances. Because as I go back to that in one of the early slides of approaches to mixing in this format, there are so many ways that a mixer can approach using beds, multiple beds, object beds, objects, all of the above. And if the I/O setup is not correct in Pro Tools and aligned perfectly with how that session was intended to be, you're in big trouble. And so that can be, for someone who's not super experienced with looking at tons of ADMs and knowing exactly how they were put together, you could mess up and spend half an hour just trying to get the thing to play back. It's not fun. That aspect of it is very challenging. Now, you can get it right if you do it all in the right order. And myself and my assistant, Andrew Chung, brilliant engineer, and just love working with him. Like, we work tirelessly when masters comes in. Like, the first thing that needs to get established is like, okay, what is this thing? How is it built? Cool. That's how I'm going to build my template. That's how I'm going to get this into the session properly. the path of least resistance. Yes, I have my approach and things I like to do, but not every file and not every approach benefits from every approach. There are way more variables here, as far as I can see, than in the stereo world from a workflow standpoint. And it's complicated. Build the puzzle. I need to understand and organize the mix before I build the puzzle. When you import an ADM BWF file, what you get is you get any beds. They remain as beds. So they remain as 712 beds or less if that person identified them in the renderer as smaller beds. And then everything else comes in as a mono track with 0 faders and the respective object number. No track names unless it was made in Logic or some other DAWs that do allow them, or if it was properly put into the binaural render window. Someone who uses a good template usually has that together. In most cases, audio 1, audio 2, audio 3, audio 4, or object 10, object 11. So I've learned to really quickly be like, that's kick drum, that's a stereo kick drum, that's a stereo bass, that's a mono vocal, that's a reverb, that's an object bed, just by looking at it. And if you can't do that, you could spend an hour just rebuilding the mix just to get it to play back and know what parameters you're working with. Because, I go through, I group the tracks, I color code them, line up the stereo master, of course. And so, and then decide upon the path of least resistance, decide upon what do I want to do? Do I need a mono trigger to do some side chaining? Do I want to maintain the beds? Do I want to spill those beds out into objects? Do I want to use multi-mono versus multi-channel plugins? So many things that are totally dependent on how the mixer did it. And if I just try to force my approach on a way that someone mixed it where they're heavily object bed based, or I try to, force a bed-based approach on someone who's really all object-based, it doesn't work. It doesn't yield the results. And I've made mistakes. I've made mistakes trying to force one into the other and been like, oh my gosh, this is not serving the music. So knowing the mix approach can be absolutely crucial to the success of the master. So, approaches. First of all, there's no correct way to master audio, right? There are approaches. There are successful approaches. There are tried and tested ones, but there's no correct way. This is an evolving ecosystem, and I will stress this, and this is one of the reasons why I'm happy to share this content. I'm not hired for my approach. I'm hired for my results. I'm hired for my aesthetics. You can use the exact same approach as me, and it's going to come out differently. And that's the beauty of our world, the diversity of our perspective, the diversity of what we individually value, right? And that comes out in audio production, and that's something that's to be treasured. I'll also say this: there's nothing that I want to do which I cannot currently achieve when mastering in immersive audio. There are definitely some more efficient ways to get there, but it would require new technology. I remember when I wrote that statement, there's a couple things I can think of, some really complicated potential future technology things where if it got created, I'd go back on this statement. But for right now, within the context of how immersive audio and how Dolby Atmos is delivered to consumers, there's nothing that I have not been able to achieve that I wanted to achieve. It requires a deep knowledge of your DAW, Pro Tools in my case. Like, you have to be able to think about how to go about achieving something in many ways to be able to find that path of least resistance. Let's define what is not Atmos mastering. It's not recording. It's not composition. It's not arranging and production. It's not editing. And it's not mixing. It's not the mix approach. It's not layout decisions. It's not object and bed ratios. It's not the setting or the intent. It's not the spatiality of panning and reverb. That is all mixing. What is Atmos mastering? It's tonal balancing, just like stereo. Looking at the overall or minute or some combination therein of the tonal balance of a file, except this time in an immersive environment. It's sonic averaging between DD plus jock for speaker playback, AC4 IMS, Apple Spatial, the ADM itself, considering all of those and finding that balance for the ultimate translatability. It's dynamic control. Absolutely it is. It might not be bus processing, which I'll clarify in a couple of slides, but it's still dynamic control, absolutely, in all of those subtle ways that make stereo mastering a beautiful process in that regard as well. It can be spatial balancing. There can be elements of individual volume requirements to be able to balance the space in a space that is tuned to this level, to the level of a mastering studio. It's LFE management, especially for people with either really small LFEs or undesirable rooms or headphones. The LFE is such an important aspect of this format, whether used subtly or aggressively, and tuning it just right is so key. It's fold-down management and having a system where you can listen to all of the various capacities. It's sequencing of records, just the same as with stereo. It's noise removal. It happens. Actually, much more in this case. In fact, there's many cases where in a master, I go back, I hear a noise. I go to that track, say, ooh, okay, I've got to remove it. I go back to the master and you're like, ooh, it's there. It got past the QC team, but it's so subtle. But actually, when it's in my side surround, I can hear it because it's so exposed. And then it's master file creation, QC, and delivery. And I've already been through a whole bunch of stuff on that front. This one will be this one will be fun. What can be Atmos mastering? Especially for spatial remixes, where the stereo master was created first and is therefore potentially acting as a little bit of a compass or as a template for the production. This is very mix adjacent, and this starts to get people sweating. It starts to get people panicking a little bit when I discuss this. Inner part balance, i.e., micro level adjustments, dynamic control on or EQ on a stem level. Spatiality, object size, or subtle, and I mean subtle, placement and binaural settings. These are absolutely on the fringe. Most mastering engineers, myself as well, even as a stereo mastering engineer, I look at this and say, whoa, now, that's mixing. And I could say, okay, fine. When this stuff is going on, it's heavily mix adjacent. What for me defines it and clarifies it as a mastering practice and not mixing is the intent and the perspective behind making those adjustments. That's as far as I can take it. If we want to call it mixing, fine. Honestly, maybe the nomenclature of mastering itself is actually maybe one of the biggest challenges in all of this discussion. But regardless, the industry calls it mastering. I don't think it's appropriate to try to find a new word. Whether this particular page is on the fringe, I have had instances, all I'll say is that I have had many, many instances where my clients who are world-class mix engineers and producers have been extremely grateful for these micro-level decisions made at mastering. And if I was to tell them, hey, I'm a mixer now, they'd be like, no, I'm the mixer, you mastered. I don't care if you did it this way. We're in different spheres and we have different relationship with this song. So it's even the mixers who I work with who are, from their perspective, defining these things which are mix adjacent as mastering, and I tend to agree with them. The path of least resistance. I've got a little question here at the top. Can we agree that the goal of a mastering engineer is often, most often, to honor the mix by manipulating as invisibly as possible in order to achieve the desired results? There are times for sure as a mastering engineer, I get a stereo file in, I get an Atmos file, whatever, and I feel like putting an imprint on it, and everyone's very happy I did. There are also the majority of times, and certainly my core philosophy, and I know I'm not alone in this capacity, where I want to take that mix for everything it is and only adjust what's absolutely necessary to find that perfect loudness, that perfect balance, that perfect cohesion, perfect by, of course, my aesthetic standards. And really, when we do gain-matched comparisons, I always want mine and I want everyone to feel like, yeah, thank you. You really took it to that next level. But sometimes it's like 5%, right? Because you're like, this is a beautiful mix. I just needed to tighten the bass a little bit. I just needed to let the highs bloom. I just needed to just dip that sibilance or work with my de-essers to just, get that under control. And so the path of least resistance is a generally excellent philosophy to take as a mastering engineer, and it is no different here. So stem mastering in stereo is often frowned upon. I personally do not practice stem mastering in stereo very often. In fact, I can't even remember the last time I did it. It typically implies a lack of confidence in the production. It typically requires more effort for the mastering engineer, and it can allow the mastering engineer to mix, which if you get into the forums, you start discussing, that's like, don't give the mastering engineer that control. Now, I'm always like, who are you working with that they took advantage of that? I don't understand. If I get a stem master, I'm like, I basically don't want to touch this. The only thing I would do is if someone said, look, I don't trust my room. I was only working in headphones. Can you please just make sure, like maybe you have to do a little bit of multi-band compression or something on this bass just before it gets summed. But even then, I'm like, I don't know about it. Then we come to the ADM BWF, the audio definition model broadcast wave format. This is the Atmos mix and ultimately the master. It is essentially a mix stem delivery. It's a multi-channel audio file that comes in with beds and then mono/split stereo object tracks. It also carries the metadata, which is the binaural render modes, the trim and downmix settings, and it then contains panning on automation, I/O, and timestamp. What matters is that when you import an ADM BWF, let's say, for instance, you used the bed for your LFE and some reverbs, and then you used 50 objects. Let's say it was actually 25 stereo objects in a spatial remix context. I'm going to receive bed, as it was, 712, let's say in this context, and then I'm going to receive 50 objects. They're all going to be zeroed for level, and I call them stems. It looks like multis, but it's not multi-track because they're committed. All of the effects, everything that was on that track, it's a fully zeroed stem out. It's an object-based stem out. And so I've got the whole mix. And let me just stress this bottom part. With great power comes great responsibility. Just because I have access to the stems does not mean I'm going to touch them. And just because I have access to the panners does not mean that I'm going to change them. I'm not going to say the name. I only did it once. I made the mistake of implying my own mix aesthetic on a project. It was very, very early on. This is like well over 2 years ago, where I was asked to master something, and there were things that I just was not comfortable with from a translation standpoint, and honestly, panning was the solution. But that was not my call to make, and it never will be again. Only need to learn once. Be reminded of the place and the mindset of the mastering engineer. And so when those stems come in and when those pannering, access to panners, etc. come in, again, if there's a mixer who's worried about that, then I have not done my job to enlist the trust of that mixer. There is trust here, But I will also say this, because I've heard this argument. Oh my goodness, I mean, I might only use beds just so that the mastering engineer can't mess with things. Well, who's messing with things? If you're sending it off to somebody and they're messing with it, then they haven't learned their lesson, and they're making a grave misjudgment on what the role of the mastering engineer is, right? And so, but I'll also say this. If you send me a stereo file for stereo mastering, if I was bad at my job, I can use all sorts of tools to rip your mix apart and make it sound completely different. I'm not going to, but the world of plugins with just with FabFilter alone, you could make a mix completely unrecognizable, right? So I think that argument of oh, you've got the stems and therefore you've got too much power, it doesn't make any sense to me. With the modern technology, everybody's got too much power. It all comes down to aesthetics. It all comes down to being responsible to the art and having the right ear and mindset and technique and system and all of the above to be able to make the decisions on the path of least resistance to maximize the file. That is the art. That is the mindset, at least for me as a mastering engineer. Approaches. 2 hours. Oh my goodness. I knew it. I mean, I warned you, and I'm not even done. Number one, the first approach to Dolby Atmos mastering is to mix and master at the same time. The mix becomes the master, and this is the most common at the moment. It's also done in stereo, right? I will say, though, it's not done in stereo at the highest level. Even myself as a stereo mixer or who has mastered my own content, in a stereo mix master context, even in the sense when it's the same engineer doing both, which is a different discussion, right? But let's just say in that context, it's a separate process. Doing it all in one session, at that point, it's not serving the potential well. And even at the highest level, where the best mixers in the world are still delivering to a separate mastering engineer, just for that final check, just for that final QC, even if they're 2,000% confident with their fully, limited and processed mix. So, but regardless, the mix master approach is currently the most common. The next one is the mono object mastering. Ruben Cohen at Lursen Mastering did some really important work. Still is, of course, great engineer, wonderful team. They shared some really valuable stuff at AES a number of years ago. And I think this went way above most people's heads, but I remember seeing it and being like, bam, that's amazing. That's an amazing idea. And he really come up with the idea of the phantom bus, where all elements become a mono object, which actually including beds. So you separate the bed out into objects. And then you use a mono mix that you have to generate from the mix itself. There's no mono fold down or mono re-render. Dolby, take note. As a sidechain trigger. And then with some really intelligent grouping functions, there was a way to have the sidechain trigger evolve in tandem with the processing. And this was the phantom bus that Ruben has identified. I would encourage you to look into it if you haven't before. Number 3, discrete channel mastering. This is just for discrete channel formats, 5.1, 7.1.4, 9.1.4, etc. All the channels are routed as mono objects to discrete speaker locations and then treated as such. Now, of course, there is no 9.1.4 bus, so it's not being dealt with in that way. So the techniques for that will actually be similar to the techniques that are used for my own approach, which I'll get to at the bottom. Then there's object-based spatial mastering. This is immersive object-based mastering, and it has been referred to. And this is the Fraunhofer Institute. There's some great conceptual work, nothing in practice yet, though, on the idea of mastering objects. Now, this doesn't exist. We don't have this tool for Dolby Atmos. But it's the idea of having some technology, some program, mastering suite technology for object-based media, where we could have objects that are mastering objects that you could then apply to groups in a cube or in a sphere. Brilliant concepts. It swirls through my head. as options and things that I would like to design and see have happen, and they've been discussed in academic papers and articles already. It's not here. Doesn't exist. The closest thing we have to correlating behavior with object-based is using sort of forcing side chains and triggers upon multiple things. And now we come to my own philosophy on it. This is actually what I described even a year and a half ago, or however long it was, is immersive object-based stem mastering. It's immersive audio, it's object-based, and it's stem mastering. That's what I refer to my practice as. I said this already. It's an object-based adaptive format. As a result, we must master Dolby Atmos content with all of the objects in play. I cannot take your heavily object-based three-dimensional mix, spit out a 714 render, and then just master that, because I have removed all of the potential of those objects. And I've turned anything that is not a discrete channel position into phantom imaging, which I already established earlier as not the ideal. Now, if it was actually a discrete channel production, that's a different story. At that point, we could argue that the 714 render is the same. But I'm saying in a situation where we've got a heavily object-based, anything with movement, anything with things between the cracks, anything with things coming into the room or up or down, the objects have to remain in play right to the very end. And so it is an object-based adaptive format, and there's no way around it. That is why there is no bus. There is no final channel count. There is no sense of one sound always going to one speaker, and therefore we can't just grab it all and say, let's do this, like we do with a bus. That's why it doesn't work. In order to do that, you would need to turn things into beds, and by doing that, we remove the objects. And by removing the objects in non-discrete channel productions, we're removing the fidelity, the translatability, and the true power of the format. Therefore, all of those objects will be stems. They will come to me in an ADM BWF as a stem out, hence immersive object-based stem mastering. What does a mastering studio require? First of all, it requires a mastering engineer who has extensive experience working in immersive audio. I would actually argue not just Dolby Atmos. Sony 360, discrete channel audio, a history with immersive audio, the aesthetics. Just being a stereo mastering engineer is not enough. Now, I will say that the ears of a stereo mastering engineer are definitely required. Just being an immersive mixer is also not necessarily enough. I actually think that the role requires a history with stereo mastering, a history with immersive audio mixing, a history with immersive audio mastering, to be able to truly amalgamate all the things that are required to even just consider how in the world am I going to approach trying to make this adaptive format that came to me even better for the client. What am I going to present here as the best option, right? Because as a mastering engineer, you want to send something back that you feel has reached its peak. You have to believe it. You do. You have to believe it. If you don't, without the confidence, it's over. You're not ready to be doing it. You need a mastering grade sonic environment. That means like speakers are at the center of this, right? And so you need a treated, calibrated, full range mastering speakers, unbelievable mastering headphones, multiple versions in my opinion, mastering converters, hardware, software, measurement tools. And I really think that you need to be a 914 at a minimum. I'm at 9.2.4 because I do have two subs, but those do sum into one LFE channel, of course. But I will soon be 11.2.6, and it's like fidelity in a camera, right? And yeah, the argument around like, well, Apple's using a 714. Okay, fine. Apple's using a 714. The idea that I should the idea from a mastering standpoint of reducing the fidelity of the mastering system because of a consumer format that will inevitably change doesn't make any sense. It's like the argument of well, why in the world am I going through this glorious chain of Fern and my Terry EQ and my Pultex and my Shadow Hills mastering compressor and the Dave Hill stuff and the SPL stuff, the Better Maker stuff and my Vice converters. What in the world am I doing that for if someone's truly going to be listening on this? Well, mastering to the lowest common denominator is just not whatever. That's not for me. And it's not for everybody who's at the top of this industry. You master for the highest common denominator. You master for the future and the now. You try to make the best possible product you can for the longest that it can possibly survive. And so, yeah, that's just sort of aesthetic discussions on it. Here's my room where I'm sitting as it is now. By the next time I make a video, there's going to be some Lipinskis up top because they just finished making height channels that I have the pleasure of having 6 of. And then there's also a side pair that are going in to finish out the array because of my obsession with cinematic. But regardless, my mastering room. A 9.2.4 mastering playback system. These are all Lipinski L707s. They're powered by Bryson 9B SS2s. Unbelievably clean amount of power. The 4 height channels are the Dolby SLS speakers, and they're also powered by the Bryson's 2 giant subwoofers. Bass management is disabled for me. I check bass management, which is in a subsequent slide, but these are full range speakers. And I think that is such a huge factor in translation. I have really attributed a lot of translation success to working with a properly tuned full range system. The subs are powered by Bryson 4B SST squareds. The conversion is the Avid Matrix, the big version, the original version, and the Digital Audio Denmark converters in it are just absolutely stunning. I use a Trinov. I had Dolby tune my room. They did a wonderful job, of course, but the Trinov just pulled this thing together in a way that is truly magical. I really appreciate what it does, especially from a translation standpoint. I do have an SPQ card as well, which is my original Dolby tuning, and I jump between it from time to time. The DAW for me is Pro Tools. The renderer, actually the mastering suite. I do have an HDX3 system, and actually this says the RedNet, but I went to an M1 computer, so I moved over to an RME MADI card. And I have an extensive hardware and plug-in collection. Room treatment is all Prime Acoustic. QC and reference, I use my Arvis to be able to check things on a consumer level with the Apple TV 4K. I also have a Blu-ray player. You have to have a Blu-ray player. You got to be checking, even just for your own enjoyment. Get a Blu-ray collection. The Atmos content on Blu-ray is so good. I do also have a Yamaha Atmos receiver, although I don't find I use it that much anymore now that I have the Arvis. I have a Sennheiser Ambio soundbar I really enjoy, and the Amazon Echo Studio. And I like to pop into audiophile shops as often as I can to see what else is coming out because it's changing fast, right? The new Apple and Sonos additions to the ecosystem are massive and are important from a translation standpoint. Then I have the dad-mom controller is what I use when I'm working in Atmos, and my Crickwood transfer console allows me to have sort of bypass modes that sort of get me more into the Digital Audio Denmark side on the Atmos thing. And then the headphones, just as important. I'm wearing the LCD5s right now. The Carbons, these Electrostats, are the most beautiful headphone ever for me. The LCD4Zs are the other ones that I use, and they dial in bass and LFE content like no headphone I've ever used. And the LCD XCs, closeback experience. They're a little bit of a brighter headphone and really show you where the sibilance is at. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean it in a transparent and an honest way. My amps are SPL Phonitor 2 and Phonitor E amps. The SPLs are fantastic, clean, simple, all being fed from the digital audio Denmark converters, and the Mjolnir Audio KG-SSHV is their solid-state electrostatic amp. Then, of course, the AirPod Max, the AirPod Pro, the AirPod Pro 2, constantly checking those things because it's part of the sonic averaging. Mastering tools. Analog. We can use analog. Analog is fantastic. Now, analog is largely, in my case, entirely limited to mono or stereo tools. But with a stem out and with the appropriate usage, there are times in mastering, definitely in mixing, I use it all the time in mixing, but in mastering, there are definitely times where when you're especially in spatial remixing content, where the stereo master was created first, and now I'm sort of chasing that stereo master. As a mastering engineer myself, sometimes you hear something and you're like, I know that this definitely went through something like a Pultec or a Shadow Hills compressor. Like not exactly, I'm not saying I have the ear for like the piece of gear, but I know that a piece of analog gear is going to get that vocal or get that front line of like the drums, the vocals, things in the left-right channels as an example, to just to tonally match that master and that energy. And so even in a mastering context, I'll use my HDIO converters are set up as insert paths with HDX so that there's, compensation's done in real time, and it's really easy to just throw this stuff on and sort of make little subgroups. But of course, also just digital mono, stereo, and multi-channel plugins, sidechain processing and advanced group linking. Pro Tools' ability to do advanced groupings is one of its greatest features, and it comes to life in Atmos. And then multi-mono and multi-channel plugins to be able to design a way to manipulate the audio with that path of least resistance in a way that ameliorates it. Tonal balancing, the refining of the overall tonal balance. These are aesthetic decisions just like stereo mastering. You have to know what you want. It can be achieved with linked EQ plugins or just individual stem EQs. And here's the reason for the stem part, right? And it seems so mixing. I know it seems so mixy. It's like you put an EQ just on the vocal. Well, that's mixing. This is not stereo. In 9.1.4, there are 14 speakers in playback, and therefore EQ decisions can be more complicated. First of all, there's significantly less masking in Atmos production, most commonly. Reverb is often separated from source as well, so brightening a reverb along with everything else can be a mistake. So let me get through this, and then I'm going to explain it all at once. The micro volume adjustments can sometimes be the most invisible form of EQ. Harmonic saturation can also be the most important way to deal with tonal balancing in this context. And there really is no need for this to happen in a bus style. So let me give a context, an example. I've got a stereo master. It's already done. Beautiful stereo master. And then I've got an Atmos production. I've got that ADM from the artist now and from the mixer. The mixer's done a fantastic job. It's a killing mix. I love everything about it. But the vocal is just like definitely not feeling as crisp and powerful as the original stereo master. If I had a bus and everything is in the bed and I want to adjust just the vocal, I'm going to adjust everything. And now that's the way in stereo mastering, right? Like that's just the way it is. So if I want to adjust something, I've got to figure out ways to do it subtly, but like the beauty of it is that glue and that sense that the whole thing moves at once. But what's different here is space. If I adjust something in the front and it affects what's in the back or on the sides, I often will feel that change in the back or the sides much more prominently than I would have when it's all together and masking itself. And so sometimes I just want to lower the volume of the vocal by like 0.3 or 0.5 of a decibel. Or I just need to roll off the tiniest bit of sibilance on the voice. But the last thing I want to do is now DS the reverbs in the rear. I want to compress the 808s or the kick a little bit to get myself some dynamic headroom, but also some tightness. And the last thing that I want is to let's say I increase the right bass frequency to sort of get a nice thump up front, but I don't want that to necessarily now make my reverbs darker in the back or create some sort of buildup in the low frequencies so that when I go to binaural in headphones, I've got all this unnecessary content. And so there's a massive advantage in my experience to having the ability to decide to do something on a mastering level, but the ability to do it invisibly actually often requires the stems. I have also worked on tons of masters that have come in on beds or object buses, and obviously I work with whatever comes in. I'm never, ever going to tell a mixer what to do. That's not my job. It's not my business. You mix however you want to mix. I'll master however it serves your mix. That's how it works. But I will say that object beds with a lot of content in them, just like stereo, now it's like, ooh, I need to bring that snare drum down. I need to control that snare drum because your system, I don't know what you were hearing, but we both agree that it needs to be controlled. Well, now I'm affecting other things. Except in those other things are less masked and they're more exposed. And so the reality of addressing something in a subtle context is actually making a more aggressive change that is undesirable. That when I can just go to the stem or I can just go to that object group or whatever and just deal with it on that level, I can be essentially invisible while leaving everything else alone and not messing with spatiality, which is so key here. Here's an example of setting up, this has been established by so many people. The film world did it first. Alan Salabank put a video out like years ago on how to set up your master tracks on the right of your session or wherever on your session and just have them as essentially final output paths where you could have stereo linked or mono linked or, whatever, EQs and saturation and limiting, etc. The film world uses this all the time to try and keep peak levels down. I really only ever use this as like linked EQ if I want to make an overarching move that definitely wants to happen to everything. But in all reality, oftentimes that move is more aggressive in a mastering context than it needs to be. I don't need to make everything brighter. I actually just need to deal with this one zone or this one instrument or this one part or this one section. And I actually don't want to mess with everything else because everything else is sitting really beautifully. Here's EQ on stems. You've seen it before. This is nothing fancy, but just an example of again, the path of least resistance. Sometimes a great mix, truly a great mix that comes to me, volume automation, Pro Q3, and the right targeted compression and saturation, and the whole thing just comes to life. But anyone who's a good stereo mastering engineer knows that that's sometimes common in stereo too. Some of the best masters ever were created because they were the best mixes ever. And the mastering engineer didn't need to jump through hoops and use 15 processors to get there. Spatial remix mastering considerations. The considerations change considerably for me when a reference stereo master is present. There's really a fundamental difference between chasing a stereo master and refining a master based on aesthetic and instinctual preferences. If I hear something that was created in Atmos first, now I'm just mastering it based on my own instincts. If I hear something where there's a stereo master that was confirmed by an artist team first, I have a responsibility to that master, unless the artist and production team have been like, don't worry about it. We know it's different. Let it go. Fine, no problem. Thank you for telling me. But most of the time, what happens is everyone's loving this Atmos. Everyone already loved the stereo master. Then they get into Atmos. They get carried away. They're like, this is amazing. It's awesome. And it is awesome. And then they come to me and I say, hey, have you considered that this doesn't really tonally match your stereo master at all? Well, no, we want them to sound good together. So now the job is to sonically average these two things together, except the stereo master can't change. No one's asking the stereo engineer to change anything. That one's done. So as a mixer, it's one thing to chase and, probably seen my stuff before. I am a mixer. I do spatial remix content every day. I did a file today. I've got another one to do tomorrow. I love working on that content as a mixer. I love it. And as a mastering engineer, I really enjoy it. But the challenge is now taking the perspective of the Atmos mixer, who is often different than the stereo mixer and definitely different than the stereo mastering engineer, and finding the right world where what happens oftentimes is I send that final master back to the mixer, and then they put them in the DAW for the, and have that moment of like, oh, thank you. Thank you for sort of like snapping me into perspective about the high end or the low end, or those drums were way too loud. They just felt so cool and so awesome. But yeah, when I compare it to the stereo master, I could see how this would, when toggling between the two on a streaming platform, or when the artist finally hears it, they'd be like, hey, something's off now that I'm like snapping between the two. And so that often becomes one of the big jobs as a spatial remix mastering engineer. Also just that subtle tonal matching, using a gorgeous system to do it. I really have trained my ears to do it, and mastering engineers in general have trained their ears to hear those 0.3 decibel changes and those tiny things up high and down low to really just bring something into focus. Subtle micro level adjustments, subtle stem level processing. Yes, it's mixing, but I'm hoping that I've established for you why, even though they're mixed techniques, they serve the path of least resistance, because I'm not messing with everything that the mixer has created to achieve that small thing that needed to get solved. There can be times where binaural metadata refinement, if I change a binaural metadata setting, I will always check with the mixer, and I will always show them why. Because everyone's ears are different in that regard, and that's a highly subjective area, and I don't want anyone to get surprised by anything. It's usually in the case where maybe like a mid just needs to go to a far, or something along those lines. Like a mid needs to go to a near, just to suggest something around like a vocal tonality thing, something along those lines. But I'm just giving one case example. I don't really want to pigeonhole it at all. The age of the spatial remix, which is what we're in right now. We are in the age where immersive audio, where both Atmos and stereo are going out to the consumer. And this holds Atmos to the standard of the pantheon of stereo production. And I think that's great. It can also feel sometimes like it holds Atmos back, but I don't necessarily like that fully, in the sense that for spatial remixing, the purpose is to serve that song which was designed for stereo. So really what we're going to see over time is more Atmos first productions and more music designed for immersive audio. And it's in that case where Atmos mastering is going to become even more like mandatory, because there's not even going to be a stereo master to consider as a reference point. Reverse engineering a stereo master is an art form unto itself. Being able to listen to a stereo master and listen to an Atmos mix, or listen and be able to identify what is the path of least resistance to achieve what I want to do. It's an art unto itself, and that has to be developed over time with a lot of work. Now, there is the Atmos Album Assembler. The assembler, I think it's coming up. I'll show it in another slide. It's a powerful tool. Dolby did a good job designing it. They never actually said it's a mastering suite, and I'm happy they didn't, because it's not. But there is an EQ in there, and it's essentially just like taking an instance of Pro Q3 and strapping it across and grouping it across all objects and beds. It's a very simple, very effective digital EQ. It's being applied to everything essentially as a mono source. It affects every individual aspect separately. There's no sense of summing, you know what I mean? Of course there's not with EQ anyways, but I will say that for me, there's way more nuance in a DAW, mainly because I can choose EQs the way that as a mastering engineer, I'm going to choose a Pultec one day, or my Terry another day, or my Curve Bender another day, or my Buzz Audio another day, or my SPL, or my Fern. I'm going to choose all those different days because of different content. And that's just as important with digital or analog in a DAW. And so I much prefer choosing my EQs for the project than using the assembler EQ, but it's functional. The only real reason to use it is there's like the tiniest adjustment when sequencing a full album. But even then for myself, I'll take that note and I'll go back to my session and do it there. Sonic averaging, probably the most important of all. So many different opinions on this, and I've sort of discussed it earlier, and you understand all the considerations from the earlier part of this, but there's so many channel layouts to consider. 914, 714, 51, stereo, checking with bass management on, then headphones for binaural, with various headphones, tonality adjustments between headphones and speakers and going back and forth. I have a very specific workflow of multiple headphones after I'm done with speakers, then going back to speakers and then doing one last version on the headphones, just to really make sure that the experience is going to be as smooth and seamless across all formats. And there is a point, there is a center, and you can find it. But it takes time and it takes confidence and aesthetics and also the right tools to be able to hear that level of subtlety. Then we come to the MP4 and Apple Spatial versus Dolby Binaural. For me, look, Logic has a spatial engine. So you can have Logic running in real time. Here's the thing. It's not one-to-one. It is just not. First of all, every time you update your iOS, first thing I do is go to my test files. I got about 10, and I listen to them in Apple Spatial because the possibility that Apple Spatial has changed ever so slightly is very high. They're constantly tweaking, and for the better, and I'm happy that they are. They continue to make it just better and better. I love it. But as a result, Logic, even on that perspective, is not updating as fast. But here's why it's not the exact same. Logic takes a 714 re-render from the ADM, from the renderer, and feeds that into its own spatial engine. As I explained before, a DD plus JOC file is not that. A DD plus JOC is spatially coded, and then they use the OAR, the Object Audio Renderer, to create a 714 from the spatially coded file. Therefore, they're not the same. And so from a mastering standpoint, I do not master straight into Logic. Rather, the only way to do it 100% accurate to that moment is to spit out the MP4, put it on an iOS device, check it on my headphones, my AirPod Pros, put it into iTunes, and then play it back over my Apple TV 4K through the Arvis. That is the only way to do it at a critical mastering level. On a mix level, getting a good sense of Apple Spatial is possible through Logic, but not at a mastering level, in my opinion. But here's the reality from a sonic averaging standpoint. I'm at the point where if it sounds great on my speakers, it sounds great in Spatial. As a mixer, I have lots of decisions that I've made around my knowledge about spatial audio versus this versus that, and I definitely mix in ways that lead to solid translation and all of that. But when I'm mastering someone else's content, my job is it's so much about tonality. The things that often bother people about binaural is like a mismanagement of upper mids and tonality and matching that stereo master. And so finding that tonal balance on my speakers, on multiple sets of headphones, using in that case the renderer for the binaural side, then going and checking in Apple, making sure that it feels good, taking note if something feels out, going back. This is all part of the mastering process. The sonic averaging considerations are so epic that it can be overwhelming. And so you need to find center, and you need to have a system that translates. If you have a system that's not translating, it's causing work, there's no way that the mastering process can be efficient enough. Just a few examples of some projects I can imagine where, basically every single project involves sonic averaging for me, but here's Jade Lamack, amazing record constellations. Jamie Fine, Josh Ross. This is Portion. This is a great project mixed by my friend Sam Ryan, Mad Key. This is called Saturn's Edge. This is a record, sort of a dance house record by Govey. Amal. This is a record mixed by the wonderful Jay Dufour here in Toronto. Also, this project was mixed by Jay in Atmos and mastered by myself. I mixed these 5, and then Sam mixed this one. Gogo Morrow, big fan of this one. Josh Ross doing so well, such a fantastic Canadian country singer. It's good to just pop in and remind ourselves about a little bit of music. I know, like, I'm so over time that I'm not even going to try now. I mean, I'm going to try to keep going into this. I'm just saying, like, hitting some sort of magical time limit. I hope you're in with me. Loudness. Why do we care so much about loudness? It's because we're aesthetically used to music being produced that way from the long-standing tradition of stereo limiting. We're also all subject to loudness levels which are continually presented in stereo music. As a result, Atmos is not in a loudness war with itself, really. I don't think that that's really happening yet, at least, and I really hope it doesn't. I hope that the normalization being built into the system, there's no point, and I'm about to discuss that. It is, however, subject to constant comparison with stereo. This has advantages and disadvantages. So as a result, precise loudness targets in Dialnorm are paramount in the successful translation of Dolby Atmos music, which I discussed in great detail earlier with all those technical considerations. Dynamic range control. There is no bus compression on the entire mix unless someone was to only mix using the 712 bed. If they did that, or multiple 712 beds, then technically you could pull that off if you really needed to or wanted to. If Pro Tools expands the bed to a 916, it'll still go to objects, which means that you could do it at the bed level, but as a mastering context, you'll never truly be able to. But what matters, and this is why I went through that whole thing at the beginning, is that's not what this is about. It's not a 714 format. It's not a 916 format. It's an adaptive format, and the objects need to be kept in play. But as a result of this complication and this lack of peak limiting on a bus or peak limiting on a mastered discrete channel format is one reason that people have decided that it cannot be mastered properly, which I am, of course, taking my sweet time trying to prove otherwise. The objects have to remain alive, which rules out discrete channel render mastering, in my opinion, unless it was a discrete channel production. Now, there are solutions to this approach. I'm going to explain some of them. Then I'm going to explain what I actually do. But there are solutions. First of all, we can have bus processing and compression and limiting plugins on a 712 bed or smaller beds as well. You can just have LCR or LR or quad or 5.1 or whatever. Anything that's on a bed can be limited. Objects will never truly be limited as one thing in the way that we consider a stereo master. Tools like Fab Filter, Flux Evo Channel, Flux Elixir, Wave Spherynx, Nugent ISL2, Tone Boosters, Compressor. These are multi-channel dynamic control plugins that can go on a bus or on a bed. Then there's also Hornet Samp, which is this. Now, this company, this is a powerful tool. What happens is you put it on as many channels as you want, and they're trying to create sort of like manipulate the system to create the effects of bus processing. You have a EQ, compressor, clipper, and limiter. The equalizer for any track that's it's on. So let's say you put it on every track in your session, and you engage them all. Then the equalizer will affect them all. Now you can achieve that with just linking EQs on your tracks. So there's no need to use this one to do that unless you love the EQ. The same with a clipper, in the sense that the clipper here is not fed by any sidechain. I'm pretty positive about that. Sorry if I'm wrong. In the sense that you could just use other clippers to peak limit essentially, or clip individual tracks that go over. The compressor and limiter are what are different here. Any track that is engaged over here, Hornet Samp creates in its own ecosystem on the side a mono sum, which is then used as a sidechain trigger. Pretty cool idea. Meaning that now, as I compress, the mono trigger is actually going to be what's triggering the compression to all aspects together. The same with the limiter. Now, where does this come from? I don't know if that, it's a good idea. At least all I'll say is that I heard about it from Ruben Cohen first, years ago. The Phantom Bus. I'm not suggesting anyone, that's out of my purview. I'm just calling it as I saw it, because this definitely came first. And Ruben came out with a very, very, very cool idea, which is take your whole ADM, turn it all into mono, develop your own mono sidechain mix, which just means make a send on everything, send it to an aux, commit it. Now, I'm not going to explain it in enough detail for you to memorize it, but essentially, as you EQ all of your stuff, you EQ the trigger. And then that EQ'd trigger now gets used for the next process. And then that compressed trigger gets used for the next process. It's very smart, and it means that as you use all of these various effects, let's say EQ, compression, saturation, multiband compression, and limiting, the trigger itself is also changing, which is mimicking more realistically how a mastering chain works. So very cool. Both very cool. And here are some examples. Now, I don't use either, to be perfectly honest, when I'm doing mono sidechain triggering. I've taken inspiration from Ruben, and Hornet Samp came out after I'd have sort of already figured out what I do with it. I definitely create a mono sidechain trigger. I have rarely found that I needed it to be the full mix. I get that in stereo, it's the full mix that's triggering compression and it gives that sense of it. I get it. I'm not opposed to it at all. My thing is that usually I don't need all the mud from like immersive reverbs to be triggering my mono side chains. I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying in my tests, I've usually developed simpler mono side chains, more based on transient material, because that's what's going to hit it anyways. That's what's going to build up my little tiny bit of limiting regardless. And as I'm going to establish here in the next slide, I'll go there and then I'll come back to this slide. The strengths. Let's just start with the strengths. There's cohesive dynamic control becomes possible. It's a repeatable approach to mastering in the format. It's something that if it's your style, then you could make every single ADM a mono splay of objects, and then make this your approach to mastering, and it would work for any file. Would it be appropriate for every file? Different question, but it would work, which can be actually challenging to find one that will work for everything. So I'll give it thumbs up there. Weaknesses for me, and this is what matters the most for me, is it is rare that I have found that I want transient information in one zone, let's call left-right LCR a zone, to affect the dynamics of another zone. I very, very rarely want the 808s in the front to be ducking my reverbs in the back. I very rarely want percussion or vocals on the sides to be ducking my vocals at the front. I very rarely want anything in the height channels to be pumping, unless I'm going for something. right? But as a mastering engineer, I'm not trying to make something that wasn't pump. So I'm not saying that that's not an option. Of course you can, whatever. There's so many reasons to do different things. But for the most part, the idea of triggering compression in a case where what happens in the front affects what's in the back has not been my approach and has not been something that I have desired. I can hear compression artifacts as a result. I find it to be more intrusive sonically than necessary most of the time. I get reverb ducking with a kick drum, except this time I can hear the reverb duck because it's literally behind me instead of in front of me. And it does also require changing the architecture of the mix. It requires taking the mix, the bed, and turning it into mono. And that's because in Pro Tools specifically, you can't link behavior of plugins across tracks with different widths, which is very annoying. Avid, please fix that. Anyways, as a result, my thing would be I will use sidechain triggers that I design myself based on what I need to affect what I want to. So I'll figure out that I need to control the dynamic range of the kick and the 808s and the bass, and I will determine the right sidechain mono content to trigger that. Or I do want the kick and the bass to, sort of pull the electric guitars in a rock song like together to get that sense of glue, right? That sense of cohesion. We're talking about subtle here, not like pumping up and down. In that context, I will use that idea of a mono sidechain trigger. And what's even cooler about printing it yourself, which Hornet Samp doesn't have, they might want to take note if they've watched this far in the video, is by just nudging my mono trigger forward, that's now my look ahead. I can create a look ahead limiter. Sony 360 actually developed a sidechain look ahead limiter in their program, which is pretty heavy. It's a big deal. It's the only one that's available in immersive audio that I'm aware of. Might not be, who knows, there might be another one out there. But in this case, just by nudging my mono trigger, I can actually create look ahead, which is like a really big deal in most digital limiters. So here's some projects. Tanya Tagak, unbelievable, heavy artist from Toronto. From Canada. And the mixer, Vic Florencia, unbelievable mixer. He mixed this project and I mastered it, and we needed to get this thing moving, and so there was some triggering that was beneficial. This record by Charmaine, also mixed by Jay DeFour. I mixed this Zed's Dead, Jan Arden, Sheepdogs, Orville Peck, and Crownlands records, and these are all, well, these four here are very much in the rock idiom, and electric guitars, drums, bass. They just needed to have cohesion, and that's why I specifically did some targeted sidechain triggering as a mastering engineer. And I'll clarify, I mix them, I export the ADMs, I import them, and I master them separately. I do it every time. It's such a good process, even if you're your own mastering engineer. And if you're not your own mastering engineer, or you're watching this and you're like, yeah, I think mastering would be a good idea, then you just send the mix off to somebody. But I can't conceive, like, doing it all at once. There's too much to consider. And also, when you're in a mix, you can't really have a mono sidechain trigger until it's all committed. So there are disadvantages as well of not being able to use certain techniques. Now, I don't use this on every project. I don't. But in the context where I do, it's very beneficial for it to be mastered separately. The Selena Martin record was mixed by Alex Gamble here in Toronto. Great mixer. And then this also just needed some of that like subtle, cohesive dynamic control. And then I also mixed and mastered this Zed's Dead tune, which is a very immersive sort of EDM style track. So I think I've actually gone over it, but my approach is to dynamic control. Let me make sure I haven't missed anything. Start with simple compression or automation even, just automation sometimes at a stem-based level. Often the most invisible way to address peak levels, which I have already defined are very important, is to add compression as close to the stem source as possible. That's all in the realm of transient management. This gets achieved with typical compression. The goal is typically to reduce transients which are causing headroom issues, right? Invisible, path of least resistance. I'm not trying to rip this thing apart. I'm not trying to crush something for no given reason, since there's not really an advantage to doing it anyways, unless that's like the sonic effect we're looking for. The targeted sidechain compression. This is what I call it. Targeted sidechain compression is specifically consciously deciding what I want to control what to create that desired sort of cohesive dynamic control effect without messing with things like in the back that I don't want. And then advanced group behavior. I also don't always just group everything, because there are times where I don't want everything to get brighter. I just want certain areas to. And when I've got a stem out, like in an ADM, I can do that. I can go through and say, you know what, I'm going to group this. I'm going to group everything in front of me and not behind me, and only EQ that. Only control the dynamic range of that with some targeted compression. So here's compression and limiting on stereo master tracks. These days, these are usually mono for me, but sometimes in spatial remixing, I set it up to be stereo so that there is stereo compression happening on stereo elements. Here's the Dolby Atmos assembler. I meant to have this a little bit earlier. So we've got our equalizer, which I already described, and then we do have a limiter. Now, this limiter is triggered by a sidechain. There's no look ahead, but it's triggered by a sidechain. This is, as a result, this is, let me just go back and show you. So you've got your threshold, you've got your output gain, attack and release. It's using a sidechain, mono sidechain to trigger it, and it will just turn everything down at once. So it's very similar to the phantom bus concept, except not quite, it's not quite as detail-oriented as you start to get into multiple stages of processing. And it's definitely similar to the Hornet SAMP approach, almost identical in that way, actually. So the thing is that, from my perspective, it's just too much. Like, let's say I've got an over. Let's say I've got an over of like 0.5. I need to get the thing down 0.5, and I don't want to just VCA it down 0.5. Limiting the whole file to find that 0.5 and then have it go 0.5 and or more, and have that now messing with dynamic range in the rears, I'd rather just go back to the session and figure out the path of least resistance to do it. I find this to be overly simple for a mastering context. Yeah, it's just, for the level of detail that I'm looking for, I don't use this in a mastering context. I think it's really well designed. I think it's really smart, but hopefully I've sort of explained why. Here are some records where the album assembler, though, was key from a sequencing standpoint. Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, Barbara Lika, Imposter Syndrome. This one specifically, I mixed every song, like it was like 2 weeks between songs. So it's almost impossible to keep perfect consistency. So throwing it in the assembler, and now what I will do is you can use clip gain, not here with the limiter, but actually per clip, you can use clip gain to adjust. And so okay, this song needs to come down. I'll never turn it up because, of course, now we're just pushing into, it's like turning a file up without a limiter. You're just going to clip. I mean, it doesn't allow it, but you can clip gain down. But then, to be honest with you, I do it in the assembler, and then I go back to my sessions and I do it in the sessions. Because if I have to have some sort of recall or something along those lines, now I've got multiple steps to deal with. So I just use the assembler almost like a QC check tool. But I rarely actually print things out of it unless I'm doing an Atmos first project with gapless playback. That's where it's like perfect. So Cannons, Fever Dreams, Jennifer Hart, 1992, Mother Mother, Oh My Heart, Arkells Blink Twice, Brandy, B7, Simi, To Be Honest. These are just some examples of records where I sequenced them in the assembler and did a whole bunch of album check work. Not necessarily final exports, but I still find it to be a brilliant tool for pulling multiple ADMs together. My loudness philosophy. You've waited so long for this. I don't know if you have. Do not mix by numbers and do not master by numbers. It doesn't work in stereo and it doesn't work here. -18, it should have a minus there. LKFS and -1 is a recommendation. For UMG, Sony, etc., there are hard rules around this, and that honestly, from a label perspective, I respect the ability to say this is our aesthetic preference for our catalog. Makes perfect sense. And so, but remember that that's the max, right? Like not every song can reach this loudness even, let alone going beyond, without sacrificing sonic qualities. There are many times where engineers are pushing to -18, -1, by having to limit things and do all sorts of things to songs that just like really weren't meant to get there. And it happens in stereo all the time. I believe that every file has its ideal loudness, and that when we find that ideal loudness, it reaches its full potential. Now, if someone asks for something louder in the stereo world, then my initial impressions, all for it. I mean, I will follow the journey, and I master hot in the stereo world for sure. Not the hottest, but I like a good robust master. And in this world, I like a good robust master as well, but I'm never going to push a file just to a number just because that's a number. It doesn't make sense, especially since normalization is available. And if I've got a record, -18 needs to be the average. There are songs that go beyond it and songs that will go underneath it commonly. So this idea, like if you're making records where every song is perfectly on -18, then you're missing the point. Like that's just not how typically mastering goes. And so anyone who's not mastered in stereo and gone through and created a relationship with what a loudness target recommendation is, there's a lot of people taking this way too seriously who don't have context for what a loudness recommendation is, and that you can deliver a little quiet. Now, delivering a little loud in this case is a different story because there are some hard rules. So fine, we have sort of a cap to a degree. Conversation for a different day about who decides that cap and what's appropriate, etc. But I get it. I totally respect that. PLR, though, is something to consider big time, and that's peak loudness ratio in terms of how normalization practices work. If you're focused on loudness normalization, which a mastering engineer should be. But I will say, like painting by numbers, the idea that I reached -18, -1, my file is mastered, it doesn't make any sense. That number doesn't mean anything about tonality. It doesn't mean anything about whether that's an appropriate loudness in relation to other tracks. It doesn't mean anything about how it's going to normalize other than dependent on what your peak value is. It doesn't mean anything about this next point, which I'm going to skip down to. The true headroom of a Dolby Atmos master is the binaural true peak limit. Actually, it's the binaural PLR, the peak loudness ratio. And what I mean is, if your file, I'll say this a couple of times, if your file is -18 LKFS -1 on the Atmos side, but then it is -16 and you are smashing the binaural limiter, which I see all the time, in my opinion, until you turn that file down, that there's no binaural limiting taking place, that is where you're actually at. So let's say you had to turn the file down 3 decibels to avoid binaural peak limiting. Very common. That means that your file is actually at -21 when you deliver it to me, because I'm not going to give you a master back with egregious binaural limiting. Have I let a few little 0.1s go here and there? Yes, especially if I'm on the louder side of things, but not by accident and not by not checking them properly with the Dolby Media Encoder. Nope. Because surprise mystery limiting, which I already defined earlier, is not an option. So the real headroom of Dolby Atmos is the binaural true peak level, and that's because AC4IMS is a real format that is being used by real streaming services, and should Spotify take it on, it is going to be the most important overnight, or at least let's just say an equally important to Apple format overnight for anyone who's sleeping on it. So when someone delivers something to me, I will VCA it down until there's no binaural limiting, and now I know how much headroom needs to be dealt with. And now I know, and we all know, like if you think, like for instance, in stereo mastering, getting a decibel just means essentially pushing into the right limit or the right way, or getting the right amount of harmonic saturation and equalization. Those are all the correct answers. But the simple answer is turn the limiter up 1 more decibel. Now that doesn't yield the best master, but it's possible without clipping, and unless you start pushing up like really, really loud. Getting a decibel of headroom out of a Dolby Atmos master, so much more work. So much more work. Getting 3 decibels out of it, it's possible. Anything's possible. What I will tell you is I definitely want to have access to that super transient stem that's causing the problem. I definitely don't want to be pumping the whole mix by 3 decibels to try and get that binaural peak level down. And pumping all the reverbs in the back on some bed approach, limiting it just so I can get my PLR and my Dialnorm under control. No. So that's where I'm sort of hopefully advocating here in terms of what the stem mastering process and the benefits of it are. And so stop painting by numbers. It's not necessary. Trust in the normalization. Trust in a mastering engineer who knows this and can achieve this content at the highest level and take care of that part of it and ensure the translation. I want my masters to play back hot. I want them to play back fairly with stereo and be right there with them. And every client that I've worked with feels that way. That's my job. So I'm all for it. I'm not saying make it weaker or have too much dynamic range just because. No, I'm not. That's not my philosophy at all. I want to get the most out of every file. But I'm not going to push to a number just because. It needs to be a conscious decision, and you need to develop a real relationship with loudness, with LUFS. You need to have a relationship with it. I can listen to a file and sort of be like, yeah, I like in my system where I'm calibrated to, be like, yeah, I sort of know where this is sitting. And when I work in my system, the calibration, etc., it's like I pretty much get to exactly where I want just by having worked in it enough. Like that's the level of intimacy that we need to have here at a mastering level in this format. Remember, the different program material, musical styles, production approaches, mix techniques, and aesthetics, they all yield different results, and that's a beautiful thing. The last point, don't be lazy with peak control, as it will have an effect on the end user experience. And by this I mean, even if Pro Tools does come out with some creative 916 bed, it will be such a shame if suddenly every file delivered or delivered for mastering has been peak limited all the way around the space just to make it easier to reach -18, -1. It would be such a shame. It's sort of like getting a stereo mix where it's like, there was a production mix with the limiter on. Usually you give it to a talented mastering engineer with the right aesthetic and the right gear, etc. They're going to exceed that and more if you provide them one without that limiting. It provides more headroom for the analog equipment. It provides just them to be able to ease that up in a way that's not just pushing fab filter up 7 decibels. And the same thing is true here. Getting close to the end. Although I'm sure you're as riveted as I am. I hope you are. LFE tuning. LFE is a powerful element in this format. I have a world-class speaker array in here, and my Trinov has helped those 2 large subwoofers to really get accurate. And it needs to be. LFE content regularly needs refinement. It needs to be accurate and precise. There needs to be that perfect low-pass filter, checking phase, potential subharmonic generation. That's getting a bit mixy, I get it, but just looking at decorrelation and understanding the importance of not masking and causing phase cancellation with your main speakers. Multiband compression and level adjustment, all very important to the LFE tuning, and I take LFE tuning very seriously. I'll describe a situation. I just recently did this project where I was the mix engineer, and then I mastered the project. I used the assembler to line it all up, and then I mastered the project in one big timeline because it is going to cinematic. So we went to the soundstage. Now, the rule typically is if you're working in a home entertainment scenario, this translation is not supposed to work from a small room to a large room. In Toronto is a beautiful place called Company 3. Steve Foster's the head mixer there, or one of the lead mixers there. Unbelievable guy, fantastic. Mike Kennedy, his assistant. We've been going back and forth and working on, really figuring out music in this room and music in that room, and it's been a fascinating and continues to be a really fascinating learning experience. And the translation from this room to that room is so exceptional. I'm grateful for it. And the LFE was the one thing especially where even in that big giant room, the ability to have a system with translation abilities that it goes down to a soundbar or headphones all the way to a cinematic playback room with accuracy, that's what needs to happen. This is where mastering can be beneficial. And for the future of these files, so that no matter where they go, if they go to a larger system, if they go to a smaller system, if they go to, who knows what the future of soundbars and wireless technology are. Having that home base of a solid speaker system and also headphones that can just truly guarantee that level of accuracy is so important, and the LFE is a big part of that. Now, checking bass management is a part of it as well. I don't work with bass management on because I don't need to, but I do check it, and I consider what possible problems there might be and then possibly look at creating solutions when necessary. Trim and downmix management. There are definitely settings which are recommended, like UMG has their recommended settings, and they're very smart, but I always audition them. They need to be set before precise loudness measurements can be considered, and they should be auditioned to ensure translation because no 2 mixes are the exact same. Here, for instance, is like the most common of manual trims and pulling our surrounds and heights to 0 decibels. With direct render and then low row, of course, on this side. But it can change, and knowing them and choosing the right one is a big deal because there are lots of situations where a fold down is going to be what gets experienced. Now, the supervised stereo fold down. This gets mixy, so I'm going to use this as a point of getting to the mastering phase. This is not a master. At this point, I'm doing for clients where I listen in stereo, we now take the Atmos master once confirmed, then make adjustments while listening in stereo, re-render to stereo. Then I master that file in stereo using a stereo chain as a stereo master so that we can use the stereo mix essentially created from the Atmos, master it for stereo to full stereo spec, maximize that file. And then I bring that back into the Atmos session that it came from essentially, and I sonically average if necessary, because there are times where the equipment that I use there'll be a little bit of magic there, and there'll be something that I will then chase with the Atmos to finish. So it's like it generated the stereo, then the stereo went off, did its thing, and then that stereo is now informing the Atmos from time to time. So always sonically averaging. Here's some examples of some projects where that was the process. Jonathan Kawchuk, Everywhen, Zune, Selena Martin, Time Spent Swimming. This was mixed by Alex Gamble. Then Dome, this is Dorcas, Yonda Oluwase, and Kaki with Majishi. These are all songs that were done that way, if you want to check them out. Sequencing, I did sort of basically describe this. This is the Dolby Atmos Assembler. Again, a brilliant tool where you can line up stereo and Atmos content. I love using it even in educational settings where I need to have a bunch of ADMs and stereo masters all lined up. For me, though, when a stereo master exists, they're already sort of the guide for sequencing, so I don't always really have to use this. But in the future of only Atmos-only projects or Atmos-first projects, this is the way to go, the album assembler. I still have my clients sequence in stereo most of the time. I'll give them stereo re-renders, have them decide upon spacing in Atmos-first projects, just because it's more consistent for them. They can pull their stereo re-renders into Logic and then identify the spaces that they want me to make. The final assembly can all be done with the assembler, but for me, one of the big concerns when a stereo master already exists is that the assembler is still frame rate based, where Pro Tools is sample rate based. And so sometimes for gapless or also just for absolute pinpoint sample accuracy, I still prefer the offline render from Pro Tools as my final file. But there are times where the sequencer and the frame rate to sample rate, sample accurate issue is not a problem, and I have definitely used it for that. Mastering, quality control, file length. We've got to have our 50 millisecond tolerance, similar identical fade-in, fade-out characteristics when there's a stereo master. The removal of unwanted sounds, empty objects being removed, loudness targets all being confirmed as appropriate, fold-down metadata being confirmed, the AC4 IMS normalization check, which I've identified as a big part of all of this, the MP4 Apple spatial check and throwing it on a soundbar, etc. Creating the Atmos master file deliverable, which is a sample accurate render. 24 frames per second, of course, and the trims, the binaural settings, no blank objects, desired normal, dial norm. I also always am delivering a binaural and having my clients 100% always listen to the binaural. They have to sign off on headphones as well, because I love the headphone version. I never send anything that I don't love the headphone version of as well. And I want them to sign off on it. I want them to give notes. I don't want them to just get wowed by the speakers, because it's not just a speaker format. It's not. And then also in a case where they have Apple technology, instruct them as to how to use the MP4. And then Dolby True HD, the Blu-ray authoring, that's a different thing, which is appropriate when going to Blu-ray. Archiving, mastering engineers. I mean, I don't know what your practices are if you're a mastering engineer, but archival work is a sort of a part of my gig, it seems. And so sessions, DAMPS files for future deliverable creation and manipulation at 96K when possible. I think we're going to see 96K be the standard very soon, because it's now possible. It has been until now as well, but we can get our final master file in that sample rate now. Loudness summary is a good thing to have, because but you could always just open it up again and get a new one, but it can be valuable. Listening and referencing. As a mastering engineer, I'm also just listening. I listen and just continue to study translation behavior of my own content. I QC every file that goes to a streaming service so that I can know what's changed, if anything's changed. I've caught errors before. I've caught upload errors. It's still new days. And yeah, maybe eventually that won't be necessary, but the referencing technology and having access to be all over this is in my opinion, the responsibility of the mastering engineer. as is communication. Just like the stereo mastering practice, but I've got to educate clients how to deliver it, how to listen, what to listen for, normalization practices, file types, deliverable usage, how they're going to use their files. Here are some challenges as we sort of close this off. I've got this, and then I've got 2 more slides, I think. Right now, we're in the stereo/immersive comparison phase. We need to move past this to realize the full potential of this audio format. Eventually, we do. But at the same time, I like where it's at. I like that Atmos is being held to that standard, because the stereo standard is the highest. And Atmos needs to be held to the immersive audio standard prior to it of discrete channel audio, the brilliant discrete channel audio masters that already exist, right? It's got to pay its dues. We've all got to raise the bar. But that comparison phase is challenging. It's challenging because you're trying to meet a whole bunch of aesthetics all at the same time. The moving target. Apple Spatial is a moving target. I don't care what we call it, but it won't be the exact same as it is today a year from now, and that's a factor. The speakers will be, though. The speakers will be. And that's something to note as to why the speaker version in a full-fledged mastering setup is still the master. It's home. It's the thing that everything will be developed out of, and it's the trunk of the tree. It's the roots of the tree. We're going to see HRTFs for spatial are already present. HRTFs for the renderer are present. That's challenging because that's also changing for people and changes their experience and makes it fundamentally different than your own. Binaural settings, we already saw it change once. If you know the Sony 360 side, it's changed multiple times. The headphone experience is going to change. I still believe it needs to sound amazing for it now, but making specific adjustments just for a headphone experience that sacrifice the speaker experience will be regretted at some point, because they will change. It will change. It's inevitable. Hopefully very small changes, but over time, in the pursuit of greatness and the pursuit of quality, we will see binaural in this format continue to evolve. The tech is changing. The sonic averaging considerations in this, as I've described, are epic. There are issues to approaching this format with stereo aesthetics. Quite frankly, you have to develop a new set of aesthetics to work properly in the Dolby Atmos format, especially as a mastering engineer. I/O setups are challenging, as I expressed at some point earlier in this presentation. And gapless and album loudness measurements require more advanced distribution. The distributors are getting better across the board, but there are still some situations where I have seen artists not have the same access at the independent level to the label level. I hope to see that change over time. So, the last thing I'm going to do is a little bit of a gratitude thing of just thanking some people. Let's answer this question. Is mastering necessary in Atmos? After all this, Atmos first. If the Atmos is the first point of production, it's mixed first in Atmos, 100%. Just like stereo, having that extra perspective is always, always, always going to be valuable. Headphone mixers, 100%. I actually encourage people getting into mixing in headphones. It's more economical, it's more practical. You can do some really cool things with it and still get the music to be what it is. And those headphone mixers, I work with a bunch of them as a mastering engineer, and then they rely on me essentially, and I rely on them. Like it's a mutual relationship where my job is to ensure that their vision is being captured and is going to translate beyond headphones, because it can't be mastered in headphones, and it has to hit a proper speaker system to ensure the future capabilities of it, as well as translation to other systems, etc. Anyone working in a compromised mix environment, less than mastering grade acoustics, less than 714, not full range speakers, not using world-class headphones, and I mean world-class headphones, mastering makes perfect sense. It's just like mixing. Someone's mixing on an amazing set of NS10s and they're creating sick mixes. They send it off to a great mastering engineer. It's the perfect pairing, right? It's the perfect pairing of technology and all of those aspects. Multiple mixers on a project, 100%. So key to being able to pull that thing together. And I have had the pleasure of doing that for a few projects, and I liked it. If it's an album, I highly recommend it. If it's, it's even if you're working on spatial remix content where there's already a stereo mix or stereo master established, you've done all the stuff, you've got all the techniques. I still think when an album's involved in 10 tracks or something like that, the perspective over the course of a record will always benefit from a second set of ears. If you're an inexperienced mixer, 100%. Anyone who's getting into this, like let's say, for instance, you watch this video and you're like, that's it, I get it. I'm just going to sonically average and do this and tune my LFE. Like if you're an inexperienced mixer, the mastering is a unbelievable opportunity to do your thing and then have it totally translate. I mean, that's even in stereo, inexperienced mixers send something to a mastering engineer. They're the ones who get something back and say, wow, how in the world did this happen? It's such a beautiful feeling when that happens as a mastering engineer. When you can really help bring something that was, to its full potential and have them be like, yes, thank you for helping me to realize this. That's the goal here, that creating that relationship, right? Serving the art together. If you're looking for perspective, 100%. And now we come to the final question, and the one that has driven this conversation. If it's a spatial remix, so stereo is done first by a highly experienced mixer who is working in a mastering grade facility, does that individual need mastering in Atmos? Here's my two-part answer. It can always be beneficial to have perspective, but I respect, because I do it myself, that it might not be necessary in that context if you have all of those boxes checked. But here's what I will say. If you don't hire someone else, you, at a certain point, are mastering. So I would say, at a certain point when we're considering loudness and Dialnorm and tonal balancing on the big picture, at a certain point, I know it's a gray area and I know it's a blurry line, much blurrier than stereo. But at a certain point, you too are mastering, and therefore mastering is a part of this process for everybody. Sort of I'm going on a limb there. I'll name some names. Does Fab Dupont, does Steve Genowick need a master for the beautiful work that they're doing, especially in spatial remix work? Well, I don't know, probably not. I've heard it. They sound amazing. Those mixes sound amazing. I will argue, though, that they have, whether they're thinking about it or not, I'd love to have this conversation, by the way, with them, because I have great respect. And I'm just naming a couple of people, so many more. I believe that they have mastered their files, but I'd like to discuss that perspective. I don't want to speak on behalf of anybody. I will say that when it comes to George Massenburg and Eric Schilling, working with Michael Romanowski on Grammy-winning projects like Alicia, they developed the mastering phase. Does George Massenburg, does Eric Schilling need a mastering engineer? I'm sure they're more than capable, but that perspective, that ability to just get that last step. And Mincelli is also a part of that combination as a producer of demanding, like, stereo's already shown us the way. So I think that we just need to get there as a community, and so that we can make sure that Atmos is always being delivered at its peak optimal state. So my gratitude here. A lot of knowledge that was shared with me and continues to be shared with me to be able to sort of develop this epic, oh my gosh, so long, longest one ever. All the labels and artists that I work with, this is all about music. Thank you. I'll say it every time I make a video because it's what it's all about. It's all coming from music. It's all about music. And so thank you for trusting me. And mixers too. Sorry, all the labels, artists, and the mixers. As a mastering engineer, the mixers who trusted me with their work, especially the community, I mean, in the States too, but the community here in Toronto and in Canada. So grateful. Jonathan Weiner and AES. I developed a lot of this stuff for a presentation that I definitely did not get all the way through at AES last fall, and you can see why. Michael Romanowski and Darcy Proper, we did an AES panel quite a while back online, and we had some beautiful discussions, and I just value and respect them so much for their work in this field and in immersive audio as a whole. Kevin, Mike, Thomas, Aaron, Christine at Dolby, thank you. Buddy at Apple, Carrie, who's now at Apple, thank you. The Recording Academy for all of the amazing workshops that they've put on Atmos. I've enjoyed learning from those and being a part of them. And the community of mixers who I've listed here, of people who are sharing and who are out there just, it takes a village, right? And so I'm sharing knowledge here that I've synthesized into my own experience, but it's not just coming only from me. And I have to thank Andrew Chung, my assistant. He's doing incredible work here at Synthesis Sound and Immersive Mastering, and I'm very grateful. So, an epic one. I hope this really puts out a lot for a lot of people to think about, and helps to bring clarity and perspective to the world of mastering in Dolby Atmos. Please subscribe if you'd like some more epic, lengthy content, and visit immersivemastering.com. Check out the music, check out the studio, keep in touch. Thanks, everybody.